Just 20 miles north of Berlin stood a concentration camp designed not only to imprison people, but to perfect terror itself. This was Sachsenhausen concentration camp, one of the most important camps operated by Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. Built in 1936, Sachsenhausen became a model camp for the SS. Officers trained here. Punishment systems were tested here, and thousands of prisoners disappeared behind its triangular walls. Political enemies, resistance fighters, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, journalists, priests, and civilians from across occupied Europe were dragged into Sachsenhausen and forced into a world of starvation, executions, disease, medical experiments, and endless forced labor. At the center of the camp stood the infamous roll call square where prisoners could be forced to stand for hours in freezing weather. Nearby was Station Z, the camp's industrial killing area, built for mass execution. But Sachsenhausen was more than just a prison. It became the administrative heart of the Nazi concentration camp system itself. Orders sent from here shaped camps across Europe. The system of terror spreading through the Third Reich was organized just outside Berlin, within sight of the Nazi capital. And as the war dragged on, the camp transformed into a machine that consumed human lives on an unimaginable scale. This is the story of Sachsenhausen, the camp near Berlin where the Nazi regime refined fear, punishment, and death into a system designed to crush humanity itself. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The camp built for the SS. As the rise of Nazi Germany transformed Germany into an authoritarian state during the 1930s, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen concentration camp was never intended to function as an ordinary prison because the camp was designed from the beginning as a central instrument of political terror, ideological control, and institutional experimentation within the expanding Nazi concentration camp system, and as this develops, the concept of deliberate design becomes central because Sachsenhausen was carefully planned and constructed near Berlin not only for practical purposes but also because its proximity to the Nazi capital carried symbolic and administrative importance for the SS leadership, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the camp represented far more than a place of detention. It became a model environment where the SS could refine systems of surveillance, punishment, forced labor, and dehumanization intended eventually to influence camps across occupied Europe. And as this develops further, the role of architecture becomes increasingly significant because Sachsenhausen's triangular layout allowed guards positioned at central watchtowers to monitor large sections of the camp simultaneously, creating an atmosphere where prisoners remained under constant observation and psychological pressure. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the camp's physical structure itself functioned as part of the machinery of domination, transforming fences, barracks, guard towers, and open squares into tools reinforcing fear and control over the inmate population. And as this develops, the concept of visibility becomes central because the camp was intentionally organized so that prisoners could be observed continuously while also witnessing punishments, executions, and suffering occurring around them, creating an environment where terror remained public and unavoidable. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the SS understood the psychological power of visibility. Inside concentration camps, using open spaces such as roll call squares and punishment areas to reinforce discipline through humiliation and fear rather than secrecy alone. And as this develops Further, the role of ideology becomes increasingly apparent because Sachsenhausen emerged during a period when the Nazi regime was rapidly expanding systems of political repression against opponents, dissidents, and groups considered undesirable under Nazi racial and social ideology, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that concentration camps served not only punitive functions but also political ones, intimidating the wider population by demonstrating the consequences of resistance, criticism, or exclusion from the Nazi vision of society, and as this develops, the concept of institutional experimentation becomes increasingly significant because Sachsenhausen became a training and administrative center for the SS concentration camp system itself, where officers learned methods of discipline, surveillance, labor organization, and prisoner control later applied throughout the expanding network of camps, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp occupied a uniquely influential role within the Nazi system precisely because it functioned partly as a prototype, through which terror could be standardized and bureaucratically organized, and as this develops further, the role of dehumanization becomes increasingly apparent because prisoners entering Sachsenhausen were stripped rapidly of personal identity through shaved heads, numbered uniforms, confiscation of belongings, and rigid camp regulations designed to reduce individuals into controlled categories within the SS hierarchy, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that such processes served psychological purposes alongside administrative efficiency, weakening individuality and reinforcing prisoner dependence upon the camp system for every aspect of survival, and as this develops, the concept of political imprisonment becomes central because many of the camp's early prisoners included communists, social democrats, trade unionists, intellectuals, journalists, religious dissidents, and others perceived by the Nazi regime as ideological threats to authoritarian rule, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen represented an essential component of the broader Nazi effort to eliminate political opposition and reshape German society through intimidation and repression long before the full expansion of the Holocaust across Europe, and as this develops further, the role of fear becomes increasingly significant because the camp's reputation for brutality spread quickly both inside and outside Germany, reinforcing the message that resistance to Nazi authority could lead to imprisonment within a system designed specifically to break bodies and spirits alike, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen was not simply built to hold prisoners but to refine and demonstrate the power of authoritarian terror itself, and thus the creation of the camp can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how the SS transformed architecture, ideology, and institutional control into one of the central engines of Nazi repression. As Sachsenhausen concentration camp expanded during the late 1930s, it becomes evident that the camp quickly evolved into one of the most important administrative and symbolic centers within the Nazi concentration camp system, because its location near Berlin allowed SS leaders to supervise operations closely while presenting Sachsenhausen as a model of discipline, organization, and ideological control under the authority of Nazi Germany, and as this develops, the concept of centralized terror becomes increasingly significant because many policies and methods later used across other camps were tested, refined, or coordinated through Sachsenhausen and its administrative structures, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the camp represented not merely one site among many but a crucial nerve center where the SS shaped broader strategies of imprisonment, forced labor, punishment, and political repression, and as this develops further, the role of the SS training system becomes central because Sachsenhausen served as a place where camp guards and administrators learned how to manage prisoners, enforce discipline, organize labor details, and sustain systems of fear. Designed to maintain total control over inmate populations, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the camp functioned partly as a school of institutionalized cruelty, where violence and dehumanization became normalized through routine administrative practice and ideological indoctrination, and as this develops, the concept of bureaucratic violence becomes increasingly apparent because the terror inside Sachsenhausen relied not only upon individual brutality but upon organized systems involving records, classifications, schedules, regulations, and hierarchies that transformed suffering into structured administration. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that one of the most disturbing aspects of the camp lay in how efficiently ordinary bureaucratic methods could be adapted toward repression once moral and legal protections disappeared beneath authoritarian ideology. And as this develops further, the role of prisoner classification becomes increasingly significant because inmates at Sachsenhausen were divided into categories identified by colored symbols and administrative labels indicating political status, nationality, religion, or racial classification, affecting their treatment, labor assignments, and survival chances within the camp. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that such classification systems reflected the wider ideology of the Nazi state, where society itself was reorganized according to racial and political hierarchies defining who belonged within the regime's vision and who could be excluded, imprisoned, or destroyed. And as this develops, the concept of public punishment becomes central because the camp administration used roll call squares, execution sites, and punishment areas not only to discipline individuals but also to terrorize the broader prisoner population through visible demonstrations of SS power and authority. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that humiliation and fear formed essential components of daily camp life, with prisoners often forced to stand for endless hours during roll calls regardless of weather, illness, or exhaustion, while guards enforced discipline through violence and intimidation. And as this develops further, the role of labor becomes increasingly apparent because prisoners at Sachsenhausen were also exploited economically through forced labor projects connected to construction, industry, and camp maintenance, integrating the camp into the broader Nazi system where imprisonment and economic exploitation became inseparable. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the concentration camp system gradually evolved beyond political imprisonment alone into a structure deeply connected to state projects, industrial production, and wartime economic planning. And as this develops, the concept of psychological domination becomes increasingly significant because the camp's rigid routines, surveillance systems, punishments, and architectural layout work together to create an environment where prisoners experienced constant emotional pressure and uncertainty regarding survival. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen functioned through total control over daily existence, regulating food, movement, labor, communication, and bodily autonomy in ways designed to erode individuality and reinforce absolute dependence upon camp authorities. And as this develops further, the role of fear outside the camp becomes increasingly apparent because Sachsenhausen's reputation spread throughout Germany and occupied territories as a symbol of what awaited those who opposed Nazi rule or failed to conform to the ideological demands of the regime. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the camp operated simultaneously as prison, labor system, administrative center, and political warning visible to both prisoners and the wider society surrounding Berlin, and thus the early development of Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how the SS transformed one camp near the Nazi capital into a model structure for organized terror and authoritarian control across Europe. Chapter 1, Segment 2. Prisoners of the Nazi State. As Sachsenhausen concentration camp expanded beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, it becomes evident that the camp quickly filled with prisoners drawn from many different parts of German society and later from occupied Europe itself, because Sachsenhausen functioned not only as a place of detention but as a tool through which the Nazi regime attempted to eliminate political opposition, suppress dissent, and isolate groups considered undesirable within its ideological vision of the state, and as this develops, the concept of targeted populations becomes central because the prisoners entering the camp reflected the broadening scope of Nazi repression during the years before and during the World War II, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that many of the earliest inmates at Sachsenhausen were political prisoners, including communists, social democrats, trade union organizers, journalists, intellectuals, clergy, and critics of the regime whose imprisonment demonstrated the determination of the Nazi state to destroy organized resistance and ideological opposition inside Germany, and as this develops further, the role of political terror becomes increasingly significant because the concentration camp system allowed the regime to imprison individuals outside ordinary legal protections while using fear of incarceration to intimidate the wider population into silence and conformity. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen represented one of the key mechanisms through which the Nazi dictatorship consolidated power by removing perceived enemies from public life and subjecting them to systems of punishment and dehumanization beyond normal judicial oversight, and as this develops, the concept of expanding repression becomes central because as Nazi racial policies intensified and German military conquest spread across Europe, the population inside Sachsenhausen changed dramatically, bringing prisoners from numerous nationalities and backgrounds into the camp system, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp evolved from a primarily German political prison into a multinational concentration camp connected directly to the broader machinery of occupation, persecution, and wartime repression operating across the continent. And as this develops further, the role of racial ideology becomes increasingly apparent, because Jews, Romani people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Soviet prisoners of war, and many others, targeted by Nazi racial and social policies, were imprisoned at Sachsenhausen under classifications that shaped their treatment and survival chances inside the camp, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the concentration camp system reflected the larger ideological structure of Nazi society itself, where human beings were divided into categories according to political loyalty, racial identity, religion, nationality, and perceived social value, and as this develops, the concept of dehumanization becomes increasingly significant because prisoners entering Sachsenhausen lost their civilian identities almost immediately through shaving, uniform assignment, confiscation of personal belongings, and replacement of names with prisoner numbers and colored classification symbols, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that these procedures served both administrative and psychological functions, reducing individuality while reinforcing the camp hierarchy imposed by the SS, and as this develops further, the role of fear becomes increasingly apparent, because many prisoners arriving at Sachsenhausen already knew of the camp's brutal reputation through rumors, propaganda, or stories circulating throughout Germany and occupied territories, creating an atmosphere where imprisonment itself became associated with terror and uncertainty, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the Nazi state relied heavily upon such fear to discourage resistance and encourage obedience among the broader population. And as this develops, the concept of shattered continuity becomes central because deportation to Sachsenhausen violently interrupted ordinary civilian life. Teachers, workers, priests, students, writers, fathers, sons, and political activists disappeared suddenly into a world governed entirely by surveillance, punishment, and forced labor, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that every prisoner transport arriving at the camp carried countless personal histories and relationships, abruptly severed by the machinery of repression, and as this develops further, the role of uncertainty becomes increasingly significant because prisoners entering Sachsenhausen often had little understanding of how long they would remain imprisoned, whether their families knew where they had been taken, or whether survival inside the camp would even be possible under the conditions awaiting them, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the prisoner population of Sachsenhausen represented not merely isolated victims but a cross-section of the groups targeted by the expanding Nazi state as it reshaped Germany and occupied Europe through terror, ideology, and authoritarian control, and thus the arrival of prisoners at Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how the camp became a central instrument of repression against political enemies, racial targets, and perceived outsiders within the Nazi system, as prisoners from across Germany and occupied Europe struggled to survive inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp. It becomes evident that daily existence within the camp was structured deliberately to destroy individuality, weaken emotional resilience, and force inmates into complete dependence upon the SS administration controlling every aspect of survival, because the camp functioned not simply as a place of confinement but as an environment engineered around discipline, humiliation, labor, and psychological domination, and as this develops, the concept of controlled existence becomes increasingly significant because prisoners lost almost all autonomy upon entering Sachsenhausen, with food, clothing, movement, communication, work assignments, sleep schedules, and bodily routines regulated entirely by camp authorities, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the destruction of personal identity formed an essential part of the camp system, since the SS sought to transform prisoners from independent individuals into anonymous inmate categories easier to exploit, punish, and control, and as this develops further, the role of classification becomes central, because colored triangles sewn onto prisoner uniforms identified inmates according to political status, religion, nationality, sexual orientation, or racial category, creating hierarchies that shaped treatment and often encouraged division within the camp population itself. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the Nazi system extended its broader ideological worldview directly into the structure of daily camp life, turning political and racial doctrine into practical systems of administration and control, and as this develops, the concept of humiliation becomes increasingly apparent because prisoners endured constant degradation through verbal abuse, forced roll calls, arbitrary punishments, invasive inspections, and public discipline, designed to erode dignity while reinforcing the absolute authority of the SS. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that humiliation served strategic purposes within the camp, weakening emotional resistance and creating environments where fear and uncertainty became permanent. features of everyday existence, and as this develops further, the role of forced labor becomes increasingly significant because prisoners at Sachsenhausen were exploited economically through construction projects, industrial production, camp maintenance, and other labor details carried out under exhausting and often dangerous conditions, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the concentration camp system gradually integrated itself into broader Nazi economic structures, transforming imprisonment into a source of labor for state projects and wartime production while consuming prisoner bodies through exhaustion and neglect. And as this develops, the concept of hunger becomes central because food inside the camp remained inadequate even for basic survival, especially considering the physical demands of forced labor and the overcrowded conditions within the barracks. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that starvation weakened prisoners physically and psychologically, increasing vulnerability to disease, punishment, and emotional collapse while forcing inmates into constant preoccupation with survival. And as this develops further, the role of disease becomes increasingly apparent because overcrowding, poor sanitation, inadequate medical care, and malnutrition allowed illness to spread rapidly through the camp population, killing many prisoners already weakened by labor and abuse. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that neglect itself became part of the machinery of suffering inside Sachsenhausen, where survival often depended upon luck, physical endurance, and fragile networks of prisoner solidarity. And as this develops, the concept of fear becomes increasingly significant because executions, punishments, and visible violence remained constant features of camp life, reminding prisoners daily that the SS controlled not only labor and discipline but also the boundary between life and death. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that terror inside Sachsenhausen relied heavily upon unpredictability, with prisoners never fully certain when guards might impose punishment, conduct selections, or target individuals for brutality. And as this develops further, the role of emotional survival becomes increasingly apparent because maintaining hope, solidarity, personal memory, or moral identity inside the camp required extraordinary psychological resilience within an environment designed specifically to destroy all four. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the prisoners of Sachsenhausen represented far more than anonymous inmates within a concentration camp. They were individuals drawn from many backgrounds whose lives became trapped within a system engineered around control, exploitation, and dehumanization near the heart of the Nazi state itself. And thus the experience of prisoners inside Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how the camp functioned as both a prison and a laboratory of authoritarian terror designed to reshape human existence through fear, labor, and domination. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The Roll Call Square. As daily life inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp became increasingly shaped by routine, surveillance, and punishment, it becomes evident that few places within the camp symbolized the power of the SS more clearly than the vast roll call square positioned at the center of prisoner existence, because this open space functioned not merely as an administrative gathering area but as one of the main instruments through which Nazi Germany enforced discipline, humiliation, and psychological control over thousands of inmates. And as this develops, the concept of public domination becomes central because prisoners were forced to gather repeatedly within the square, under conditions designed specifically to reinforce obedience and remind inmates that every aspect of their existence remained under total SS authority. And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the roll call square represented far more than a routine checkpoint inside the camp. It became a stage upon which fear, exhaustion, and punishment were displayed openly before the entire prisoner population, and as this develops further, the role of routine becomes increasingly significant because prisoners at Sachsenhausen were required to assemble for roll calls early in the morning and often again at night regardless of whether illness, injury, or exhaustion from forced labor, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that even ordinary administrative procedures were transformed deliberately into mechanisms of suffering inside the concentration camp system, and as this develops, the concept of exhaustion becomes central because roll calls frequently lasted for hours while guards counted prisoners, verified records, imposed punishments, or waited for administrative corrections, forcing inmates to stand motionless under freezing winter conditions, heavy rain, burning summer heat, or deep physical exhaustion after long labor shifts, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the physical strain of remaining upright for endless periods intensified suffering among prisoners, already weakened by starvation, disease, and labor, turning the square itself into another site of slow bodily destruction, and as this develops further, the role of humiliation becomes increasingly apparent because the roll call process reduced prisoners into numbered bodies arranged systematically beneath armed surveillance, stripping away individuality while reinforcing the camp hierarchy imposed by the SS, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that public visibility formed an essential part of the system's power, since prisoners standing in formation witnessed constantly the weakness, collapse, punishments, and suffering of those around them, creating collective psychological pressure throughout the camp population. And as this develops, the concept of fear becomes increasingly significant, because the square also served as a place where guards conducted public punishments, beatings, and executions intended to terrorize inmates and discourage resistance or disobedience, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the SS used spectacle strategically, understanding that visible violence could control thousands of prisoners more effectively than hidden punishment alone, and as this develops further, the role of uncertainty becomes increasingly apparent, because prisoners entering the roll call square often did not know whether the gathering would remain a routine count or escalate suddenly into punishment, selection, interrogation, or execution, creating an atmosphere where anxiety accompanied every assembly, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that unpredictability itself functioned as a weapon inside Sachsenhausen, trapping inmates within permanent emotional tension and fear regarding their survival, and as this develops, the concept of environmental control becomes central because the square's wide open design exposed prisoners directly to weather and surveillance while emphasizing the overwhelming authority of guards positioned around the camp, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the architecture of Sachsenhausen intentionally amplified feelings of exposure, vulnerability, and helplessness among inmates gathered within the central square, and as this develops further, the role of collective punishment becomes increasingly significant, because guards frequently forced entire prisoner groups to remain standing for extended periods as punishment for escapes, missing inmates, administrative discrepancies, or alleged rule violations, causing widespread suffering regardless of individual responsibility, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that such practices reinforced the Nazi concentration camp system's disregard for personal rights or justice, replacing individual accountability with collective terror and submission, and as this develops, the concept of psychological erosion becomes central because endless roll calls gradually destroyed emotional resilience by trapping prisoners within repetitive cycles of exhaustion, fear, humiliation, and uncertainty that consumed both body and mind, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the roll call square functioned as one of the most important symbolic spaces within Sachsenhausen precisely because it concentrated so many aspects of camp life: discipline, surveillance, suffering, and dehumanization into one visible environment at the heart of the camp, and thus the roll call square can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how routine itself became transformed into an instrument of terror inside the Nazi concentration camp system. As prisoners continued enduring daily assemblies inside the roll call square of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, it becomes evident that the square shaped not only physical suffering but also the emotional and psychological atmosphere of the camp itself, because nearly every prisoner at Sachsenhausen passed repeatedly through this space where fear, uncertainty, punishment, and exhaustion became woven into the rhythm of everyday existence beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, and as this develops, the concept of emotional domination becomes increasingly significant because the SS used the roll call square not merely to count prisoners but to demonstrate constantly that the camp administration possessed total control over time, movement, and survival inside the camp, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that forcing prisoners to stand motionless for endless hours under brutal conditions carried psychological meaning beyond administrative necessity, reinforcing the idea that inmates no longer controlled even the most basic aspects of their bodies or daily routines, and as this develops further, the role of waiting becomes central because prisoners trapped inside prolonged roll calls experienced a form of helpless suspension where exhaustion, hunger, cold, and fear accumulated while time itself seemed weaponized against them through endless delays and uncertainty, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that waiting inside the square often became psychologically unbearable precisely because prisoners never knew when the ordeal would end or what additional punishments might emerge during the gathering, and as this develops, the concept of visible collapse becomes increasingly apparent because guards and fellow inmates frequently witnessed prisoners fainting, collapsing from weakness, or dying during roll calls after prolonged exposure to cold, starvation, disease, or overwork, turning the square into a public display of human deterioration within the concentration camp system, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that such scenes intensified awareness among prisoners that physical collapse could happen to anyone trapped within the camp environment, especially as malnutrition and forced labor steadily weakened the inmate population over time, and as this develops further, the role of public fear becomes increasingly significant because executions and punishments carried out in or near the roll call square were intentionally visible to large groups of prisoners, reinforcing obedience through spectacle and emotional intimidation, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the SS relied heavily upon collective witnessing to sustain discipline, understanding that visible violence created psychological pressure extending far beyond the immediate victims themselves, and as this develops, the concept of dehumanization becomes central because the roll call process reduced prisoners into numerical units standing in formation beneath constant surveillance, eroding individuality while reinforcing bureaucratic systems of categorization and control central to the Nazi concentration camp network, and as one reflects on It becomes clear that repeated participation in such routines gradually reshaped prisoners, where survival often overshadowed normal emotional and social relationships. And as this develops further, the role of solidarity becomes increasingly apparent, because despite the helping exhausted inmates remain standing, sharing information, or offering emotional encouragement under conditions where even small acts of assistance carried profound significance, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that maintaining humanity inside Sachsenhausen required extraordinary resilience precisely because the camp system attempted continuously to replace solidarity with fear and isolation. And as this develops, the concept of symbolic space becomes increasingly significant because the roll call square eventually came to represent the broader logic of the concentration camp itself, a place where routine administration merged with humiliation, punishment, surveillance, and suffering beneath the power of the SS. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that survivors later remembered the square not simply as a physical location but as an emotional center of camp life where dread accompanied every gathering and where countless prisoners endured some of the most psychologically destructive experiences of imprisonment. And as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly apparent, because after liberation former prisoners often described the endless roll calls among the most haunting elements of Sachsenhausen, symbolizing the complete domination of human existence within the camp system. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the roll call square revealed how authoritarian systems can transform ordinary administrative procedures into instruments of terror when human beings are stripped of dignity, rights, and individuality beneath structures of ideological control. And thus, the central square of Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, exposing how routine, visibility, and public suffering became powerful tools within the machinery of Nazi repression near Berlin. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Forced Labor and Endless Exhaustion. As Sachsenhausen concentration camp expanded beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, it becomes evident that forced labor stood at the center of daily life inside the camp, because the SS viewed prisoners not as human beings deserving dignity or protection but as expendable sources of labor whose bodies could be exploited continuously through exhaustion, hunger, punishment, and fear. And as this develops, the concept of labor as domination becomes central because work inside Sachsenhausen functioned not only as economic exploitation but also as a method of punishment and psychological control designed to weaken prisoners physically while reinforcing total obedience to the camp system. And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that prisoners entering Sachsenhausen quickly discovered that survival depended largely upon enduring endless cycles of labor carried out under brutal conditions with little food, inadequate clothing, almost no rest, and constant supervision from guards prepared to punish even small mistakes with violence or humiliation. And as this develops further, the role of exhaustion becomes increasingly significant because inmates often worked for extremely long hours in construction projects, workshops, industrial facilities, brickworks, road building operations, and camp maintenance details while already weakened by starvation and overcrowded living conditions. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the labor system at Sachsenhausen was intentionally structured to push the human body beyond sustainable limits, creating an environment where collapse, injury, illness, and death became ordinary features of everyday existence. And as this develops, the concept of expendability becomes central because the SS administration generally viewed prisoners as replaceable labor units rather than individuals, allowing catastrophic physical deterioration and high death rates to become accepted. Consequences of camp operations so long as labor productivity continued, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the concentration camp system depended heavily upon constant prisoner transports arriving from Germany and occupied Europe in order to replace those consumed by labor, starvation, disease, and punishment, and as this develops further, the role of economic exploitation becomes increasingly apparent, because Sachsenhausen gradually became connected to wider Nazi industrial and wartime production systems where prisoner labor supported factories, construction programs, military infrastructure, and economic projects linked directly to the German state, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that forced labor camps formed an important part of the Nazi war economy, merging ideological persecution with economic exploitation in ways that transformed imprisonment into a system of industrialized human consumption, and as this develops, the concept of routine suffering becomes increasingly significant, because labor details often began before dawn and continued until evening regardless of weather conditions, illness, or physical exhaustion trapping prisoners within repetitive cycles of work and punishment that steadily destroyed bodily strength over time. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that exhaustion inside Sachsenhausen emerged not from isolated acts of brutality alone but from a sustained system where every aspect of camp life, roll calls, inadequate food, overcrowded barracks, forced labor, and constant surveillance combine to erode physical endurance gradually, and as this develops further, the role of punishment becomes increasingly apparent, because guards frequently used labor itself as a disciplinary weapon, assigning prisoners to especially difficult tasks, extending work hours, or inflicting beatings and humiliations during labor details in order to enforce obedience through fear. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that work inside Sachsenhausen differed fundamentally from ordinary employment because prisoners possessed no freedom to refuse dangerous tasks, seek medical recovery, or protect themselves from abuse within the camp hierarchy. And as this develops, the concept of dehumanization becomes central, because labor assignments reduced inmates into categories defined primarily by usefulness and productivity rather than individuality or human worth, reinforcing the Nazi ideological belief that certain populations existed only to serve and eventually disappear beneath systems of exploitation. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that forced labor represented one of the clearest ways the camp translated ideology into daily physical reality, transforming abstract political and racial hatred into endless bodily suffering carried out hour after hour near the Nazi capital. And as this develops further, the role of fear becomes increasingly significant, because prisoners understood that visible weakness, inability to work, or failure to meet expectations could lead to punishment, reduced survival chances, or transfer into even more dangerous labor details, creating constant anxiety surrounding physical endurance and bodily collapse. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that forced labor at Sachsenhausen revealed how authoritarian systems can weaponize work itself against imprisoned populations. Once human beings are stripped of rights and reduced into expendable instruments of state power, and thus the labor regime inside the camp can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, exposing how exhaustion became one of the primary mechanisms through which the SS controlled, exploited, and destroyed prisoners near Berlin. As prisoners continued enduring forced labor inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp, it becomes evident that exhaustion shaped every aspect of camp existence because physical labor could never be separated from hunger, disease, fear, and emotional collapse within an environment designed specifically to consume human strength over time. And as this develops, the concept of cumulative suffering becomes increasingly significant because prisoners rarely experienced a single source of hardship in isolation. Instead, starvation weakened bodies before labor began, overcrowded barracks prevented proper rest, disease spread through weakened populations, and endless work details accelerated deterioration day after day beneath the authority of Nazi Germany. And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that many prisoners arrived at labor details already physically exhausted from roll calls, poor sleep, cold exposure, and inadequate nutrition, making the daily work regime especially destructive for bodies pushed continuously beyond recovery. And as this develops further, the role of starvation becomes central, because food rations inside Sachsenhausen remained grossly insufficient considering the heavy labor demanded from inmates, leaving prisoners trapped in permanent states of hunger that weakened muscles, damaged immune systems, reduced concentration, and intensified vulnerability to illness and injury. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that starvation itself functioned as part of the labor system, ensuring that prisoners remained physically weakened and increasingly dependent upon camp authorities for survival. And as this develops, the concept of bodily collapse becomes increasingly apparent, because prisoners often fainted, stumbled, or collapsed during labor assignments after prolonged exhaustion and malnutrition, particularly in physically demanding work details connected to construction, transport, and industrial production. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that collapse carried terrifying consequences inside the camp, since guards frequently interpreted weakness as laziness or disobedience, responding with beatings, humiliation, or further punishment rather than medical assistance. And as this develops further, the role of fear becomes increasingly significant because prisoners understood that inability to continue working could mark them as expendable within the camp hierarchy, increasing the likelihood of selection for punishment, neglect, or death. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the labor system operated through constant psychological pressure where inmates feared not only physical exhaustion itself but the consequences of appearing too weak to remain useful. And as this develops, the concept of environmental brutality becomes central because labor continued through freezing winters, rain, mud, and summer heat while prisoners wore inadequate clothing and already suffered from severe malnutrition and disease, turning weather itself into another force intensifying bodily destruction inside the camp. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen's environment amplified suffering continuously, with prisoners moving between overcrowded barracks, exhausting labor details, and endless roll calls without opportunities for genuine recovery or safety. And as this develops further, the role of industrialization becomes increasingly apparent because the camp's forced labor system reflected broader Nazi efforts to integrate concentration camps into wartime economic production, linking prisoner exploitation directly to factories, workshops, and state projects supporting the German war effort. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that modern industrial systems became deeply entangled with structures of repression and dehumanization. Once authoritarian ideology normalized the treatment of prisoners as disposable labor resources, and as endless labor under catastrophic conditions gradually destroyed emotional resilience alongside physical endurance. trapping prisoners within repetitive cycles where survival itself consumed nearly all mental and bodily energy, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that many inmates experienced overwhelming hopelessness precisely because the labor system appeared endless, with no certainty regarding release, survival, or escape from the camp's machinery of exhaustion, and as this develops further, the role of solidarity becomes increasingly apparent. Because despite the brutality surrounding them, prisoners sometimes supported one another quietly. During labor details through shared effort, warnings, or assistance helping exhausted inmates continue working long enough to avoid punishment or collapse, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that such acts of cooperation represented forms of resistance against a system designed specifically to isolate, weaken, and dehumanize those trapped within it. And as this develops, the concept of extermination through labor becomes central because, although Sachsenhausen served multiple functions within the Nazi concentration camp system, revealed how labor itself became a gradual mechanism of destruction inside the camp, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the endless exhaustion endured by prisoners near Berlin exposed one of the most terrifying capabilities of authoritarian systems, the ability to transform ordinary work into an organized method of suffering and death once human beings are stripped of dignity and reduced into expendable instruments of state power, and thus the forced labor regime of Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how exhaustion became inseparable from survival within the machinery of Nazi terror. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Station Z, the Killing Area. As the system of terror inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp expanded during the years of the World War II, it becomes evident that the camp evolved beyond a place of imprisonment and forced labor into a site directly connected to systematic killing, because within Sachsenhausen the SS constructed a separate execution complex later known as Station Z, an area specifically designed to carry out executions, conceal death, and intensify the machinery of terror operating near Berlin. And as this develops, the concept of industrialized killing becomes central because Station Z reflected the broader transformation of the Nazi concentration camp system into an environment where murder itself became bureaucratically organized and physically integrated into camp infrastructure beneath the authority of Nazi Germany. And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the naming of Station Z carried symbolic meaning, because the camp entrance was associated with the beginning of imprisonment, while the execution complex represented the final destination for countless prisoners whose journey through the camp ended in death. And as this develops further, the role of concealment becomes increasingly significant because the SS attempted to organize executions in ways that maintained administrative efficiency while reducing visible disruption to the broader camp population, even though rumors, smoke, disappearances, and survivor testimony ensured that prisoners remained deeply aware of the fear surrounding the area. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that Station Z represented one of the clearest examples of how the Nazi regime sought to transform killing into a controlled institutional process carried out within bureaucratic systems rather than spontaneous acts of violence alone. And as this develops, the concept of fear as governance becomes central because the existence of a dedicated killing area reinforced psychological terror throughout Sachsenhausen by reminding prisoners constantly that the SS possessed absolute authority over life and death inside the camp. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that uncertainty surrounding executions intensified emotional pressure among Inmates already weakened by forced labor, starvation, disease, and punishment particularly, because prisoners often witnessed individuals disappear into the camp system without return. And, as this develops further, the role of execution methods becomes increasingly apparent because Station Z contained facilities connected to shootings, hangings, cremation, and other forms of execution used against political prisoners, resistance members, Soviet prisoners of war, and many others targeted by Nazi repression, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the camp's killing infrastructure reflected the wider escalation of violence occurring across Nazi-occupied Europe as the regime radicalized persecution policies and expanded systems of mass murder during the war years, and as this develops, the concept of bureaucratic death becomes increasingly significant because executions at Sachsenhausen were often organized through records, classifications, orders, and administrative procedures that reduced human lives into categories processed within institutional structures of repression, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that one of the most disturbing aspects of Station Z lay in how ordinary administrative systems became intertwined with systematic killing once ideological. Dehumanization removed moral constraints from state power, and as this develops further, the role of Soviet prisoners of war becomes increasingly apparent because many Soviet POWs brought to Sachsenhausen faced especially brutal treatment and mass executions within the camp system. Under Nazi racial ideology and anti-Bolshevik policies, demonstrating how the war against the Soviet Union intensified violence across the concentration camp network, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that Station Z reflected not only local camp brutality, but also the broader genocidal direction of Nazi policy during the war, where entire categories of people were increasingly viewed as expendable enemies to be eliminated systematically. And as this develops, the concept of psychological terror becomes central because even prisoners who never entered Station Z lived under the shadow of its existence, aware that execution remained a permanent possibility within the camp environment and that the boundary between forced labor and death could disappear suddenly through punishment, illness, or arbitrary selection. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the killing area amplified fear throughout Sachsenhausen, precisely because it symbolized the final stage of dehumanization within the concentration camp system, and as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly significant, because after liberation survivors and investigators identified Station Z as one of the most important locations within the camp for understanding the scale and organization of Nazi violence near Berlin, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the construction of Station Z revealed how the concentration camp system evolved from political imprisonment into a machinery where labor, punishment, and institutionalized killing became increasingly inseparable, and thus the creation of the execution complex can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, exposing how Sachsenhausen transformed into a camp where terror culminated in organized death. As executions continued inside the Station Z complex of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, it becomes evident that the killing area shaped the emotional atmosphere of the entire camp because fear of disappearance, punishment, and death surrounded prisoners constantly even when executions themselves occurred away from the central barracks and labor details, and as this develops, the concept of invisible terror becomes increasingly significant because many inmates understood only fragments of what occurred inside Station Z through rumors, smoke rising from cremation facilities, missing prisoners, whispered testimony, and the terrifying silence surrounding those taken away by the SS, And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that uncertainty itself became a powerful instrument of psychological control, trapping prisoners within permanent anxiety regarding what might happen if they became too weak politically, suspicious, or unable to continue labor inside the camp system. And as this develops further, the role of disappearance becomes central because inmates often saw fellow prisoners vanish suddenly from barracks or work details without explanation, reinforcing awareness that survival inside Sachsenhausen depended entirely upon the arbitrary decisions of camp authorities, operating beneath the ideology of Nazi Germany. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that Station Z functioned not only as a physical execution site but also as a symbolic presence looming over daily camp life, intensifying fear throughout the prisoner population even among those who never directly witnessed its operations. And as this develops, the concept of normalized death becomes increasingly apparent, because the existence of a dedicated killing area reflected how deeply violence and extermination had become embedded within the concentration camp system by the later years of the war, transforming death into an organized administrative process integrated directly into camp infrastructure. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the Nazi regime increasingly treated human lives as categories to be managed, exploited, or eliminated through bureaucratic systems operating with terrifying efficiency and emotional detachment. And as this develops further, the role of dehumanization becomes increasingly significant because prisoners processed through Sachsenhausen were stripped systematically of individuality long before entering Station Z, allowing the SS to carry out executions within ideological frameworks portraying victims as enemies, racial outsiders, or expendable populations rather than human beings deserving empathy or moral protection. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that such dehumanization formed the foundation of the entire concentration camp system, enabling ordinary institutional structures to legal and moral concern. And as this develops, the concept of fear within routine becomes central, because prisoners attempting to survive daily camp life, labor details, roll calls, hunger, and overcrowded barracks, did so while fully aware that the camp contained a space dedicated specifically to execution and cremation, reinforcing the understanding that death remained permanently integrated into the environment surrounding them. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the psychological burden of such awareness intensified hopelessness and emotional exhaustion among inmates already struggling physically to survive under catastrophic conditions. And as this develops further, the role of secrecy becomes increasingly apparent, because although the SS attempted to conceal certain aspects of execution procedures, survivor testimony and later investigations revealed the systematic nature of killings carried out within the camp, exposing how bureaucratic organization and institutional planning supported murder beneath the appearance of administrative order. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that Station Z revealed one of the most terrifying characteristics of modern authoritarian systems: the ability to organize killing through ordinary administrative methods, while masking brutality beneath procedure, regulation, and institutional structure. And as this develops, the concept of historical evidence becomes increasingly significant, because after the war, investigators documenting Sachsenhausen identified Station Z as crucial proof of how concentration camps evolved into integrated systems combining forced labor, punishment, imprisonment, and execution under centralized SS authority. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that preserving the memory of the execution complex matters not only for understanding Sachsenhausen itself but also for understanding how modern states can transform bureaucracy and ideology into machinery of systematic violence. And as this develops further, the role of remembrance becomes increasingly apparent, because survivors who spoke about Station Z ensured that the prisoners executed there would not disappear entirely into silence despite the Nazi attempt to erase victims through cremation, secrecy, and administrative concealment. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the killing area at Sachsenhausen stands today as a warning about the catastrophic consequences of dehumanization and unchecked state power, and thus, Station Z can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how the concentration camp near Berlin evolved into a place where organized terror culminated in systematic death. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Medical Experiments and Human Cruelty. As the power of Nazi Germany expanded across Europe during the World War II, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen concentration camp evolved into more than a site of imprisonment, forced labor, and execution, because within the camp prisoners were also subjected to medical experiments that reflected one of the darkest intersections between modern science, ideology, and institutionalized cruelty inside the Nazi concentration camp system. And as this develops, the concept of science without morality becomes central, because doctors and researchers connected to the SS used prisoners as unwilling human test subjects under conditions where consent, dignity, and human rights no longer existed within the authoritarian structure of the camp. And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the experiments conducted at Sachsenhausen were possible only because the Nazi regime had already stripped prisoners of legal and moral protection through racial ideology and dehumanization, transforming inmates into expendable bodies available for exploitation in the name of military research, political ideology, or pseudo-scientific ambition. And as this develops further, the role of dehumanization becomes increasingly significant, because the camp system encouraged medical personnel to treat prisoners not as patients but as objects for experimentation whose suffering or death carried little importance within Nazi ideological frameworks. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the experiments at Sachsenhausen exposed how professional expertise and scientific knowledge can become instruments of violence once ethical boundaries collapse beneath authoritarian ideology. And as this develops, the concept of institutional cruelty becomes central, because the experiments often occurred within organized administrative systems involving records, procedures, schedules, and official oversight, demonstrating that brutality inside the concentration camp system was not chaotic but deeply integrated into bureaucratic and professional structures. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that one of the most disturbing realities of Sachsenhausen lay in how ordinary institutions associated with medicine and research were transformed into tools of suffering inside the camp environment. And as this develops further, the role of military research becomes increasingly apparent, because some experiments conducted on prisoners related directly to German wartime interests, including testing the effects of harsh conditions, disease, wounds, exhaustion, or survival under extreme circumstances connected to military operations. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the demands of war intensified the willingness of Nazi authorities to exploit concentration camp prisoners in pursuit of scientific and military objectives regardless of human cost. And as this develops, the concept of bodily exploitation becomes increasingly significant, Because prisoners at Sachsenhausen endured procedures causing severe pain, permanent injury, illness, or death while possessing no ability to refuse participation or escape the authority of the SS-controlled medical system surrounding them, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the experiments represented an extension of the broader camp logic where prisoners' bodies were treated as resources to be controlled, exploited, and ultimately destroyed according to the needs of the regime, and as this develops further, the role of fear becomes increasingly apparent, because inmates inside Sachsenhausen understood that selection for medical experiments could lead to unimaginable suffering or death, creating another layer of terror within a camp already dominated by forced labor, punishment, and executions, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the threat of experimentation intensified the atmosphere of helplessness surrounding prisoners whose survival depended entirely upon systems viewing them as expendable, and as this develops, the concept of moral collapse becomes central because the participation of educated medical professionals in such experiments challenged assumptions that education, science, or professional training automatically protect societies from brutality or dehumanization, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen revealed how dangerous modern institutions become once ideology overrides ethical responsibility and human beings are categorized according to political or racial value rather than shared humanity. And as this develops further, the role of testimony becomes increasingly significant because survivors later described the fear, injuries, and psychological trauma associated with medical experimentation inside the camp, preserving evidence of crimes the Nazi regime attempted partly to conceal beneath institutional secrecy and wartime chaos, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the experiments at Sachsenhausen exposed one of the most terrifying aspects of the concentration camp system, the transformation of science itself into a mechanism of organized suffering under authoritarian rule, and thus the medical experimentation carried out near Berlin can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how human cruelty entered even the institutions traditionally associated with healing and care. As prisoners endured medical experiments inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp, it becomes evident that the emotional and psychological impact of these procedures extended far beyond the physical injuries themselves, because inmates trapped within the camp understood that even institutions associated traditionally with healing had become dangerous under the authority of Nazi Germany, creating an environment where fear surrounded doctors, infirmaries, and medical examinations rather than trust or protection, and as this develops, the concept of corrupted medicine becomes increasingly significant because the Nazi concentration camp system transformed medical authority into another instrument of control and violence, undermining the ethical foundations normally associated with healthcare and scientific research, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that prisoners often experienced profound psychological terror regarding selections for experimentation precisely because they possessed almost no information about what procedures awaited them or whether survival would even be possible afterward, and as this develops further, the role of uncertainty becomes central because inmates inside Sachsenhausen frequently lived under conditions where rumors spread through barracks regarding experiments, disappearances, injuries, and deaths connected to camp medical facilities, intensifying anxiety throughout the prisoner population, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that fear itself became part of the machinery of experimentation, trapping prisoners within emotional environments where bodily autonomy and personal safety had disappeared completely beneath institutional power, and as this develops, the concept of bodily ownership becomes increasingly apparent, because the experiments demonstrated the extent to which the camp system claimed absolute authority over prisoners' bodies, reducing human beings into objects available for labor, punishment, medical testing, or execution according to the demands of the Nazi state, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that such total control represented one of the defining characteristics of the concentration camp system itself, where inmates lost nearly all protection against physical exploitation once categorized as expendable within Nazi ideology, and as this develops further, the role of professional participation becomes increasingly significant because doctors, researchers, and medical staff involved in experimentation often operated within formal institutions and bureaucratic systems rather than outside them, revealing how ordinary professional structures could become entangled in organized cruelty when ethical boundaries collapsed beneath authoritarian rule, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen exposed a wider danger within modern societies, the possibility that science, medicine, and institutional expertise can serve destructive political systems when human beings are divided into categories considered worthy or unworthy of moral concern, and as this develops, the concept of survival after trauma becomes central because prisoners who survived medical experiments often carried lifelong physical injuries and psychological scars connected to pain, fear, helplessness, and the memory of being treated as less than human inside the camp system, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that liberation did not erase the consequences of experimentation, since survivors continued living with trauma long after the collapse of Nazi Germany and the end of the war, and as this develops further, the role of testimony becomes increasingly apparent, because survivor accounts preserved crucial evidence regarding the nature of medical crimes committed inside Sachsenhausen, helping investigators and later generations understand how deeply ideology and dehumanization penetrated even professional and scientific institutions during the Holocaust. And, as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that such testimony carried enormous importance after the war precisely because the Nazi regime had attempted to disguise many crimes beneath secrecy, bureaucracy, and wartime confusion, and as this develops, the concept of ethical warning becomes increasingly significant because the experiments conducted at Sachsenhausen demonstrated how scientific research detached from morality can become catastrophic once human dignity and informed consent disappear beneath systems of state power and ideological extremism, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp's history continues warning later generations about the necessity of protecting ethical standards, human rights, and personal autonomy within medicine and scientific research regardless of political pressure or national crisis, and as this develops further, the role of remembrance becomes increasingly apparent because preserving the stories of prisoners subjected to experimentation restores humanity to victims whom the Nazi system attempted to reduce into anonymous test subjects and disposable bodies inside the concentration camp near Berlin, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the medical crimes at Sachsenhausen revealed one of the most disturbing truths of the Holocaust era, that cruelty can emerge not only from hatred and violence alone but also from institutions claiming to represent knowledge, progress, and professional authority once empathy and moral responsibility are abandoned, and thus the history of experimentation inside Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative exposing how science itself became corrupted within the machinery of Nazi terror. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Medical Experiments and Human Cruelty. As the power of Nazi Germany expanded across Europe during the World War II, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen concentration camp evolved into more than a site of imprisonment, forced labor, and execution because within the camp prisoners were also subjected to medical experiments carried out under conditions where human beings had been stripped entirely of legal protection and reduced into objects for testing beneath SS authority. And as this develops, the concept of science without morality becomes central because the experiments conducted inside Sachsenhausen revealed how medicine itself could be distorted into an instrument of cruelty once ideology, racism, and authoritarian power replaced ethical responsibility, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the Nazi regime viewed certain prisoners not as patients deserving care but as expendable bodies available for experimentation in pursuit of military, political, or pseudoscientific goals connected to the war effort and racial ideology. And as this develops further, the role of dehumanization becomes increasingly significant because the ability to perform painful and often lethal experiments depended entirely upon first denying the humanity of the prisoners subjected to them, reducing individuals into categories classified as inferior, dangerous, or disposable within the worldview of Nazi Germany. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the experiments at Sachsenhausen formed part of a broader collapse of moral boundaries inside the concentration camp system, where scientific authority and institutional power became intertwined with systems of terror and repression. And as this develops, the concept of institutional cruelty becomes central because medical personnel operating inside the camp often worked within organized structures supported by the SS administration, using prisoners for testing while relying upon the concentration camp environment itself to provide total control over captive populations unable to refuse participation or escape abuse. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp system created conditions uniquely suited for such exploitation by isolating prisoners completely from legal oversight and redefining them as objects of state power rather than human beings with rights or bodily autonomy. And as this develops further, the role of military interests becomes increasingly apparent because some experiments conducted at Sachsenhausen related directly to wartime concerns involving survival, disease, equipment testing, or physical endurance under extreme conditions, reflecting how the Nazi regime increasingly linked science, medicine, and military objectives during the war years. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the pressures of total war intensified the willingness of authorities to pursue research through methods involving coercion, violence, and lethal disregard for prisoner welfare. And as this develops, the concept of suffering disguised as research becomes increasingly significant because many experiments inflicted severe pain, permanent injury, disease, or death upon prisoners while offering little genuine scientific value, revealing how ideology and cruelty frequently outweighed legitimate medical inquiry within the camp system. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the language of research and medicine often concealed realities of torture carried out against defenseless inmates beneath institutional authority. And as this develops further, the role of fear becomes increasingly apparent because prisoners inside Sachsenhausen lived under constant awareness that selection for experiments could occur unpredictably through camp authorities possessing complete control over inmate bodies and survival, intensifying psychological terror. already created by forced labor, starvation, executions, and punishment, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that medical experimentation represented another dimension of domination inside the concentration camp system, extending SS control even into the physical integrity of prisoners themselves, and as this develops, the concept of moral collapse becomes central because the experiments at Sachsenhausen demonstrated how professional expertise and scientific institutions can become corrupted when ethical responsibility disappears. Beneath authoritarian ideology and obedience to state power, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp revealed one of the darkest possibilities of modern civilization: the transformation of medicine from a profession dedicated to healing into a mechanism participating directly in suffering and death, and as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly significant because survivor testimony and post-war investigations later exposed the brutality of experiments conducted at Sachsenhausen, ensuring that the victims subjected to these abuses would not vanish entirely into silence after the collapse of the Nazi regime, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the medical crimes committed inside the camps stand today as warnings regarding the dangers of dehumanization, ideological extremism, and scientific practice detached from moral accountability, and thus the experiments at Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how cruelty and pseudoscience merged within the machinery of Nazi terror near Berlin. As medical experiments continued inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp, it becomes evident that the camp environment itself made such abuses possible because prisoners existed within a system where the SS controlled every aspect of life, movement, labor, and survival, eliminating any possibility of consent, protection, or legal defense against exploitation, and as this develops, the concept of total vulnerability becomes increasingly significant because inmates selected for experiments possessed almost no power to resist authorities who already determined access to food, shelter, medical treatment, and survival within the camp, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the concentration camp system created conditions where human beings could be isolated completely from ordinary moral and legal structures, allowing medical personnel and SS authorities to operate within environments where cruelty became normalized. Through ideology, hierarchy, and institutional obedience, and as this develops further, the role of psychological terror becomes central, because prisoners often lived in fear not only of labor, punishment, or execution but also of becoming subjects for painful procedures, disease testing, or experiments capable of causing permanent injury or death, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the threat of experimentation intensified the atmosphere of uncertainty and helplessness already shaping daily existence inside Sachsenhausen. And as this develops, the concept of bodily control becomes increasingly apparent because the experiments represented one of the clearest expressions of how thoroughly the Nazi system claimed ownership over prisoner bodies, treating inmates as resources available for military, ideological, or institutional purposes rather than autonomous individuals deserving dignity and protection. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that such control reflected broader Nazi racial ideology, which categorized certain populations as biologically inferior or politically expendable and therefore suitable for exploitation without moral concern. And as this develops further, the role of bureaucracy becomes increasingly significant because medical experimentation inside the camp often relied upon records, classifications, approvals, schedules, and administrative coordination. connecting doctors, SS officials, and camp authorities within organized institutional systems, and, as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the crimes at Sachsenhausen were not isolated acts of individual madness alone but part of wider structures where professional expertise, state ideology, and authoritarian power reinforced one another, and as this develops, the concept of normalized cruelty becomes central because repeated exposure to suffering inside the concentration camp system gradually desensitized many perpetrators, allowing extreme abuse to become integrated into routine administrative and medical practice beneath the language of research or wartime necessity, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that one of the most themselves to extraordinary brutality once ethical boundaries disappeared and victims were stripped of humanity through propaganda and racial doctrine, and as this develops further, the role of survivor memory becomes increasingly apparent, because prisoners who survived Sachsenhausen later described not only the physical pain of experiments but also the emotional devastation of being treated as less than human within systems claiming scientific legitimacy, while inflicting deliberate suffering, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that preserving these testimonies remains essential for understanding the full reality of the camp beyond statistics or administrative history alone, and as this develops, the concept of post-war reckoning becomes increasingly significant because the exposure of medical crimes committed in camps like Sachsenhausen after the war contributed directly to international debates regarding medical ethics, human experimentation, and the responsibilities of scientific professionals operating under state authority, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the atrocities committed inside the camp forced the world to confront difficult questions about the relationship between science, morality, obedience, and political power in modern society, and as this develops further, the role of warning becomes increasingly apparent, because Sachsenhausen demonstrated how easily professions associated with healing and knowledge can become corrupted when authoritarian ideology encourages dehumanization and rewards obedience over ethical responsibility, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the medical experiments inside the camp remain historically significant not only because of the suffering inflicted upon prisoners but because they reveal how modern institutions themselves can become instruments of cruelty once moral safeguards collapse beneath extremism and unchecked authority, and thus the human experimentation carried out at Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative exposing how science and medicine were transformed into tools of terror within the Nazi concentration camp system near Berlin. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Counterfeit Money and the Nazi War Machine. As the World War II intensified and the military ambitions of Nazi Germany demanded increasingly desperate strategies, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen concentration camp evolved into more than a site of imprisonment, labor, and execution, because hidden within the camp the SS developed one of the most unusual and secretive operations connected to the Nazi war effort, a massive counterfeit currency project designed to weaken enemy economies and finance German intelligence activities through forged banknotes, and as this develops, the concept of economic warfare becomes central because the operation reflected how the Nazi regime attempted to weaponize not only armies and weapons but also finance, industry, and human. That the counterfeit operation at Sachsenhausen relied heavily upon prisoners themselves, particularly inmates possessing backgrounds in printing, engraving, banking, graphic design, and technical crafts whose skills the SS exploited under coercive conditions inside the camp, and as this develops further, the role of forced expertise becomes increasingly significant, because unlike many labor details centered on physical exhaustion alone, the counterfeit project depended upon intellectual and technical abilities extracted from prisoners who remained trapped within the same broader system of terror, starvation, and surveillance shaping all camp life. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen revealed how deeply the concentration camp system had become integrated into the wider Nazi war machine, extending exploitation beyond manual labor into specialized economic and strategic operations connected directly to state objectives. And as this develops, the concept of hidden labor becomes central, because the counterfeit workshops operated in relative secrecy within the camp while prisoners involved in the project lived under constant pressure to produce high-quality forged currency, capable of deceiving Allied financial systems. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that secrecy intensified the atmosphere surrounding the operation, since inmates understood that their survival depended partly upon remaining useful to the SS while also recognizing that failure or exposure could lead to execution or disappearance within the camp system. And as this develops further, the role of counterfeit currency becomes increasingly apparent, because the project focused heavily on forging British banknotes and later other forms of currency with extraordinary precision, representing one of the largest counterfeiting operations ever attempted during wartime. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the operation reflected growing desperation within Nazi strategy as Germany sought unconventional methods to undermine opponents and sustain intelligence activities amid the escalating pressures of global conflict. And as this develops, the concept of moral contradiction becomes increasingly significant, because prisoners participating in the operation existed within deeply complex conditions where technical skill and cooperation with camp authorities sometimes increased survival chances even while they remained imprisoned within a brutal system built upon forced labor and dehumanization. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the counterfeit project created unusual psychological tensions among inmates forced to contribute intellectually to the Nazi war effort while simultaneously existing as victims of Nazi persecution themselves. And as this develops further, the role of privilege within terror becomes increasingly apparent, because prisoners assigned to the counterfeit workshops often received slightly improved conditions compared with ordinary labor details, including somewhat better food, indoor work environments, and reduced exposure to physical exhaustion. Yet these limited privileges existed entirely at the mercy of SS authorities and never removed the constant threat of violence or death. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the camp system frequently manipulated survival differences in order to extract specialized labor and maintain control over prisoner populations through dependency and fear. And as this develops, the concept of bureaucratic exploitation becomes central, because the counterfeit project required organization, technical planning, administrative oversight, and coordination between camp officials and broader Nazi intelligence structures, demonstrating again how modern bureaucratic systems could integrate concentration camp labor into complex wartime operations. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen functioned not only as a prison but as a hidden component of the Nazi state apparatus where economic strategy, intelligence operations, and human exploitation intersected beneath conditions of coercion and terror. And as this develops further, the role of survival becomes increasingly significant, because prisoners working within the counterfeit workshops often understood that their technical usefulness temporarily protected them from the most lethal forms of camp labor while also trapping them within constant uncertainty regarding how long such protection might last, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the counterfeit operation at Sachsenhausen exposed another disturbing dimension of the concentration camp system, the ability of authoritarian regimes to exploit even the talents and intelligence of imprisoned populations while simultaneously denying their humanity and freedom, and thus the counterfeit currency project can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how Sachsenhausen became connected directly to the hidden economic warfare of the Nazi regime near Berlin. As the counterfeit operation inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp continued under SS supervision, it becomes evident that the project revealed extraordinary contradictions within the Nazi concentration camp system because prisoners selected for the operation occupied a strange position between exploitation and temporary usefulness, surviving within an environment of terror while producing forged currency intended to strengthen the very regime imprisoning them. And as this develops, the concept of coerced survival becomes increasingly significant, because inmates involved in the counterfeiting workshops understood that their technical abilities gave them slightly better chances of remaining alive compared with prisoners trapped in brutal outdoor labor details, yet those survival chances remained entirely dependent upon continuing to serve the needs of Nazi Germany, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the counterfeit workshops created unusual psychological conditions inside the camp where prisoners carried out highly skilled intellectual work while surrounded constantly by fences, guards, executions, starvation, and the wider machinery of concentration camp violence. And as this develops further, the role of uncertainty becomes central, because inmates understood that the privileges associated with the operation could disappear instantly if the SS no longer required their expertise or if wartime circumstances changed, creating an atmosphere where survival remained fragile despite relatively improved conditions. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the operation demonstrated how the camp system manipulated human desperation strategically, rewarding usefulness temporarily while maintaining absolute control through fear and dependence. And as this develops, the concept of hidden resistance becomes increasingly apparent, because some prisoners reportedly attempted subtle acts of sabotage or delay within the counterfeit project whenever possible, recognizing that the forged currency supported Nazi military and intelligence objectives even while direct resistance carried enormous danger inside the camp environment. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that resistance inside Sachsenhausen often required extraordinary caution and creativity precisely because prisoners operated beneath constant surveillance and within systems where punishment could mean execution or transfer to lethal labor conditions. And as this develops further, the role of intellectual labor becomes increasingly significant because the counterfeit operation revealed that the Nazi regime exploited not only physical strength but also artistic skill, technical expertise, and specialized knowledge extracted from imprisoned populations through coercion. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen reflected the broader flexibility of the concentration camp system, adapting prisoner exploitation to serve economic. The concept of bureaucratic criminality becomes central because the counterfeit project required coordination between camp officials, intelligence agencies, printing specialists, administrators, and SS leadership, exposing how ordinary institutional structures could participate in highly organized criminal enterprises beneath authoritarian rule. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the operation illustrated the extent to which the Nazi state integrated concentration camps directly into its broader wartime strategies rather than treating them merely as isolated prisons, and as this develops further, the role of secrecy becomes increasingly apparent, because the counterfeit project remained highly classified due to its potential strategic importance, meaning prisoners involved in the workshops lived with the constant awareness that they possessed dangerous knowledge capable of making them expendable if the SS decided secrecy required elimination of witnesses, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that fear within the workshops extended beyond ordinary camp terror into anxiety surrounding the hidden political and military significance of the operation itself, and as this develops, the concept of moral complexity becomes increasingly significant, because surviving within the counterfeit unit often required prisoners to navigate impossible ethical conditions, where cooperation with camp authorities increased survival chances even while contributing unwillingly to the Nazi war effort, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the concentration camp system forced inmates repeatedly into situations where ordinary moral choices became distorted by coercion, fear, and the constant struggle to remain alive, and as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly apparent, because survivor testimony after the war later exposed the existence of the counterfeit operation and revealed how deeply the Nazi regime depended upon forced prisoner labor even in highly specialized strategic projects. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the counterfeit workshops at Sachsenhausen revealed another terrifying capability of authoritarian systems: the ability to transform imprisoned human beings into tools of state policy while simultaneously denying them freedom, dignity, and legal existence, and thus the counterfeit currency project can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, exposing how the concentration camp near Berlin became intertwined not only with terror and forced labor but also with the hidden economic warfare strategies of the Nazi state. Chapter 3, Segment 3. Death Marches from Sachsenhausen. As the military collapse of Nazi Germany accelerated during the final months of the World War II, it becomes evident that conditions inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp deteriorated into chaos, starvation, overcrowding, and escalating fear because the approaching advance of Allied armies forced the SS to confront the possibility that concentration camps and their prisoners might soon fall into enemy hands, and as this develops, the concept of collapse without mercy becomes central because even as the Nazi regime itself began disintegrating militarily and politically, the machinery of terror inside Sachsenhausen continued operating with deadly intensity rather than suddenly weakening or disappearing, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the final phase of the camp system became one of the most catastrophic. Precisely because the SS sought simultaneously to preserve control, conceal evidence, continue exploitation, and prevent prisoners from surviving to testify about the crimes committed near Berlin, and as this develops further, the role of evacuation becomes increasingly significant, because camp authorities ordered massive prisoner evacuations as Soviet forces approached from the east, forcing thousands of already starving and exhausted inmates onto long marches away from Sachsenhausen under armed guard, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that these evacuations were not humanitarian transfers but brutal extensions of the concentration camp system itself, carrying terror, exhaustion, and death onto roads stretching across collapsing wartime Germany, and as this develops, the concept of movement without freedom becomes central, because prisoners marched endlessly under SS supervision despite the apparent collapse of Nazi authority around them, trapped physically between advancing armies, destroyed infrastructure, and guards determined to maintain control even in the final days of the regime. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the death marches revealed the extreme commitment of the SS to preserving domination over prisoners regardless of Germany's military defeat. And as this develops further, the role of physical exhaustion becomes increasingly apparent because many prisoners forced out of Sachsenhausen had already endured years of starvation, forced labor, disease, punishment, and overcrowded barracks before being compelled to march enormous distances with little food, water, rest, or medical care. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the human body simply could not sustain such conditions for long, causing countless prisoners to collapse along roadsides from weakness, illness, exposure, or injuries accumulated during years inside the camp system. And as this develops, the concept of arbitrary death becomes increasingly significant because guards frequently shot prisoners who stumbled, slowed down, attempted escape, or became physically unable to continue marching, reinforcing fear through public violence even as the Nazi state itself disintegrated around them. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the death marches represented one of the clearest examples of how thoroughly dehumanization had shaped SS behavior, allowing exhausted prisoners to be treated as expendable obstacles rather than human beings during the final collapse of the war. And as this develops further, the role of environmental brutality becomes increasingly apparent because prisoners marched through freezing temperatures, rain, mud, and devastated wartime landscapes while wearing inadequate clothing, and already suffering from severe malnutrition, turning the environment itself into another instrument of destruction. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that nature and war combined with SS violence to create conditions where survival became extraordinarily difficult for inmates already weakened beyond normal endurance. And as this develops, the concept of uncertainty becomes central because prisoners marching away from Sachsenhausen often possessed little knowledge regarding where they were being taken, how long the marches would continue, or whether liberation might arrive before death overtook them along the roads. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that psychological suffering intensified physical exhaustion as rumors, fear, and confusion spread through columns of starving prisoners moving through a collapsing Reich. And as this develops further, the role of visible disintegration becomes increasingly significant because prisoners witnessed destroyed towns, fleeing civilians, retreating soldiers, bombed infrastructure, and collapsing state authority surrounding them during the marches, revealing the broader destruction consuming Nazi Germany even while the concentration camp system continued functioning violently. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the death marches from Sachsenhausen exposed the horrifying reality that the Nazi machinery of terror remained deadly until the final days of the regime itself, and thus the evacuation marches can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how the concentration camp near Berlin carried suffering and death outward across the collapsing landscape of wartime Germany. As the death marches from Sachsenhausen concentration camp continued through the collapsing territories of wartime Germany, it becomes evident that the marches transformed roads, forests, villages, and open countryside into extensions of the concentration camp system because prisoners remained trapped within the same structures of fear, violence, starvation, and total control that had defined life inside the camp itself. And as this develops, the concept of endless Imprisonment becomes increasingly significant because leaving Sachsenhausen did not bring freedom for the prisoners but instead forced them into another phase of suffering where movement itself became part of the machinery of extermination beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the marches exposed how deeply the SS remained committed to domination even during the final collapse of the Nazi state, continuing to guard, punish, and kill prisoners despite the rapidly approaching defeat of Germany and the visible destruction surrounding them, and as this develops further, the role of starvation becomes central because prisoners marching away from Sachsenhausen received almost no adequate food or clean water while being forced to cover enormous distances on foot, leaving already weakened bodies increasingly incapable of sustaining movement through exhaustion and exposure, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that hunger itself became a weapon during the marches, reducing physical strength, impairing thought, and intensifying desperation among prisoners struggling simply to remain alive from one day to the next. And as this develops, the concept of collapse in public view becomes increasingly apparent, because unlike hidden camp suffering occurring behind fences and guard towers, the death marches unfolded openly across roads and civilian areas where local populations sometimes witnessed starving prisoners collapsing beneath armed supervision, revealing fragments of the concentration camp system beyond the camp boundaries themselves. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the marches blurred distinctions between battlefield collapse and organized persecution, carrying the reality of concentration camp terror directly into the wider landscape of the dying Third Reich, and as this develops further, the role of fear becomes increasingly significant because prisoners understood constantly that falling behind, collapsing, or appearing too weak to continue could lead to immediate execution by guards determined to maintain discipline through terror, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that fear accompanied every step of the marches, trapping inmates within conditions where physical exhaustion and psychological terror reinforced one another continuously, and as this develops, the concept of survival through solidarity becomes central, because despite catastrophic conditions, prisoners sometimes attempted to support one another by sharing food scraps, helping exhausted inmates remain standing, or offering emotional encouragement whenever possible during the endless movement across devastated territory, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that such acts of solidarity represented extraordinary forms of humanity within a system specifically designed to destroy compassion and reduce prisoners into isolated bodies struggling individually for survival. And as this develops further, the role of uncertainty becomes increasingly apparent, because rumors regarding advancing Allied armies spread constantly through prisoner columns. While no one knew precisely how close liberation might be or whether the SS intended eventually to massacre prisoners before surrendering, creating emotional conditions where hope and terror existed simultaneously, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that psychological tension during the death marches reached extraordinary levels precisely because the end of the war appeared near, yet death remained present every hour along the roads. And as this develops, the concept of visible state collapse becomes increasingly significant because prisoners marching through Germany witnessed bombed cities, fleeing civilians, retreating military units, shortages, and administrative chaos, exposing the breakdown of Nazi authority even while concentration camp violence continued operating with deadly force. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the death marches revealed both the collapse and persistence of the Nazi system at the same time. The state was disintegrating militarily, yet its structures of terror still consumed human lives until the final moments, and as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly apparent because survivors later described the marches from Sachsenhausen as among the most traumatic experiences of the entire camp period, combining starvation, exposure, fear, and endless uncertainty within landscapes filled with death and exhaustion, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the death marches exposed one of the final and most brutal expressions of Nazi dehumanization, showing how prisoners continued to be treated as expendable bodies even as the regime responsible for their suffering collapsed around them, and thus the evacuation marches from Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how the concentration camp system extended its machinery of terror far beyond the camp gates into the final chaos of the war itself. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Liberation and the Discovery of the Camp. As the military defeat of Nazi Germany became unavoidable during the final weeks of the World War II, it becomes evident that the liberation of Sachsenhausen concentration camp revealed not only the collapse of a concentration camp but the exposure of an entire system of organized terror, operating just outside Berlin, because when Allied and Soviet forces reached the camp they encountered overwhelming evidence of starvation, forced labor, executions, disease, and mass suffering hidden for years behind fences, guard towers, and SS administration, and as this develops, the concept of liberation amid catastrophe becomes central, because freedom arrived for surviving prisoners only after countless inmates had already died from exhaustion, violence, hunger, medical neglect, and the brutal death marches carried out during the collapse of the Nazi state, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen by the final days of the war had become a landscape of physical and emotional devastation where overcrowded barracks, empty work details, abandoned administrative structures, and emaciated prisoners testified directly to the destruction created by the concentration camp system, and as this develops further, the role of abandonment becomes increasingly significant, because many SS guards fled the camp as enemy forces advanced, leaving behind disorganized structures and surviving prisoners trapped within conditions already pushed beyond collapse by years of systematic abuse and the chaos of the final evacuation period, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the collapse of Nazi authority inside Sachsenhausen did not immediately erase suffering but instead exposed the catastrophic human consequences produced by years of dehumanization and exploitation beneath the rule of Nazi Germany, and as this develops, the concept of visible truth becomes central, because liberating forces entering the camp encountered undeniable physical evidence of the concentration camp system: skeletal prisoners weakened by starvation, overcrowded infirmaries filled with disease, execution facilities, cremation areas, punishment structures, and the administrative machinery that had sustained terror so close to the Nazi capital itself, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen revealed how deeply organized violence had become embedded within modern bureaucratic and institutional systems during the war years, and as this develops further, the role of shock becomes increasingly apparent because soldiers, journalists, medical workers, and investigators arriving at the camp often described overwhelming horror when confronted directly with the physical condition of prisoners and the visible scale of suffering inside the camp environment, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the liberation of concentration camps fundamentally transformed global understanding of the Holocaust and Nazi repression by exposing realities many outside observers had previously struggled to imagine fully, and as this develops, the concept of survival after terror becomes increasingly significant, because the surviving prisoners of Sachsenhausen emerged from years of forced labor, starvation, punishment, executions, and psychological trauma into a world where liberation itself could feel unreal after prolonged existence inside a system designed to erase dignity and hope, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that many survivors remained physically unable to celebrate freedom immediately due to disease, weakness, injury, and emotional exhaustion accumulated over years of imprisonment, and as this develops further, the role of testimony becomes increasingly apparent, because survivors quickly became essential witnesses describing the operations of the camp, including forced labor systems, Station Z, medical experiments, death marches, and the administrative role Sachsenhausen played within the wider Nazi concentration camp network, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that survivor testimony prevented the crimes committed at Sachsenhausen from disappearing into silence or denial after the war ended, preserving the experiences of prisoners whose suffering might otherwise have remained hidden behind SS secrecy and wartime destruction. And as this develops, the concept of evidence becomes central because documents, structures, prisoner records, and physical remains found inside the camp provided investigators with direct proof of systematic repression, forced labor, executions, and institutionalized cruelty carried out beneath state authority, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen stood not merely as a prison but as evidence of how modern political systems could construct organized environments dedicated to terror and dehumanization, and as this develops further, the role of historical confrontation becomes increasingly significant because liberation forced Germany and the wider world to confront the reality that such a camp had operated near Berlin under the administration of educated professionals, bureaucrats, industrial systems, and state institutions rather than isolated criminals alone, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the liberation of Sachsenhausen exposed the terrifying capacity of modern societies to normalize organized cruelty beneath authoritarian ideology and bureaucratic control, and thus the discovery of the camp can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how liberation transformed hidden systems of terror into visible historical truth. As surviving prisoners emerged from the collapsing structures of Sachsenhausen concentration camp after liberation, it becomes evident that freedom did not instantly erase the physical and psychological devastation created by years of imprisonment, because the human body and mind carried deep scars from starvation, forced labor, executions, disease, fear, and the constant emotional pressure of surviving inside the Nazi concentration camp system, and as this develops, the concept of liberation after dehumanization becomes increasingly significant because prisoners leaving Sachsenhausen had spent years inside an environment specifically designed to strip away individuality, autonomy, and dignity beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that many survivors experienced liberation with rather than immediate celebration alone, and as this develops further, the role of physical collapse becomes central because countless prisoners remained severely malnourished or dangerously ill, even after the camp fell, with some survivors dying shortly after liberation from diseases and bodily damage caused by prolonged starvation and abuse inside Sachsenhausen, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the concentration camp system continued claiming lives even after SS authority disappeared because the effects of systematic deprivation had already devastated prisoner bodies beyond recovery in many cases, and as this develops, the concept of humanitarian crisis becomes increasingly apparent, because liberating forces faced enormous challenges providing food, medical treatment, sanitation, and shelter for surviving inmates whose conditions reflected years of catastrophic neglect and exploitation, and an enormous humanitarian disaster requiring urgent intervention amid the wider chaos of post-war Europe. And as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly significant, because survivors understood quickly that Sachsenhausen represented more than personal suffering alone. It embodied a larger system of terror that needed to be documented and remembered in order to expose the crimes committed beneath Nazi rule, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that survivor testimony became one of the most powerful forms of resistance against Nazi efforts to erase victims through executions, cremation, secrecy, and bureaucratic concealment. And as this develops, the concept of witness responsibility becomes central because former prisoners described forced labor, roll call punishments, station Z medical experiments, death marches, and starvation conditions in extraordinary detail after the war, ensuring that future generations would understand the realities hidden behind the concentration camp fences near Berlin. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that testimony transformed survivors from isolated victims into historical witnesses carrying the burden of preserving truth about Sachsenhausen and the broader Holocaust. And as this develops further, the role of evidence becomes increasingly apparent, because the liberation of the camp preserved physical structures, documents, execution areas, prisoner records, and administrative systems that investigators later used to expose the organized nature of Nazi repression and violence. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen disproved any attempt to portray concentration camp crimes as isolated acts of wartime chaos, revealing instead a highly structured system supported by bureaucracy, ideology, and state authority. And as this develops, the concept of moral reckoning becomes increasingly significant, because the discovery of the camp forced societies across Europe and beyond to confront difficult questions regarding obedience, complicity, political extremism, racism, and the fragility of human rights under authoritarian systems. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen stood as a warning not only about Nazi Germany itself but also about the broader human capacity to normalize cruelty once targeted groups are stripped gradually of dignity and protection. And as this develops further, the role of remembrance becomes increasingly apparent, because preserving the history of the camp ensures that the prisoners who suffered and died there are remembered as individuals rather than disappearing into anonymous statistics beneath the machinery of terror. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the liberation of Sachsenhausen transformed the camp from a hidden instrument of repression into one of the clearest historical symbols of how authoritarian power, bureaucracy, ideology, and dehumanization can combine to create systems of organized suffering within modern society. And thus, the liberation and discovery of Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, exposing the reality of the camp while preserving the voices and memories of those who endured it. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Sachsenhausen after the war. As the World War II ended and the regime of Nazi Germany collapsed beneath military defeat, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen concentration camp did not immediately disappear from history after liberation because the camp continued existing physically and politically within the unstable environment of post-war Germany, where ruins, occupation zones, displaced populations, and emerging Cold War tensions shaped the future of former concentration campsites across Europe. And as this develops, the concept of contested memory becomes central because Sachsenhausen transformed from a Nazi concentration camp into a location carrying multiple layers of historical meaning connected to dictatorship, repression, liberation, occupation, and remembrance. And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the camp's proximity to Berlin gave it unusual symbolic importance during the post-war years, since the former center of Nazi terror now existed within a divided Germany struggling to confront the legacy of authoritarianism and mass violence. And as this develops further, the role of Soviet occupation becomes increasingly significant because after liberation the area surrounding Sachsenhausen fell under Soviet control, and parts of the former camp complex were reused by Soviet authorities as a special internment camp during the immediate post-war period, creating another chapter of imprisonment and political repression within the same physical landscape. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen's history after 1945 reflected the broader instability of post-war Europe, where liberation from Nazi rule did not immediately produce freedom or reconciliation for everyone living within territories shaped by occupation and ideological conflict. And as this develops, the concept of continuity within changing power becomes central because although the Nazi concentration camp system itself had collapsed, the campsite remained connected to structures of detention and political control during the chaotic years following the war. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the physical environment of Sachsenhausen carried powerful symbolic weight precisely because it had already become associated with fear, imprisonment, and state authority long before the Cold War divisions of Europe emerged. And as this develops further, the role of memory politics becomes increasingly apparent because different governments and political systems interpreted the history of Sachsenhausen in different ways depending upon their ideological priorities and visions of the past, particularly within divided Germany where East and West developed contrasting approaches toward confronting Nazi crimes and commemorating victims. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that remembrance after the war was never entirely neutral but shaped constantly by political struggles surrounding responsibility, national identity, and historical interpretation. And as this develops, the concept of selective remembrance becomes increasingly significant because early memorialization efforts sometimes emphasized certain categories of victims while overlooking or minimizing others depending upon the political climate and dominant narratives of the period. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the complexity of Sachsenhausen's prisoner population, including political dissidents, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, resistance fighters, clergy, homosexuals, and many other groups, made comprehensive remembrance both morally necessary and politically difficult within post-war Europe. And as this develops further, the role of physical preservation becomes increasingly apparent because maintaining parts of the campsite allowed future generations to confront directly the structures where roll calls, forced labor, executions, and imprisonment had occurred, transforming Sachsenhausen into a place where history remained physically visible rather than disappearing entirely beneath reconstruction and urban development. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that preserving the camp carried profound educational importance, precisely because the surviving buildings, fences, watchtowers, and execution areas exposed how ordinary administrative spaces had been transformed into machinery of terror under authoritarian rule, and as this develops, the concept of historical confrontation becomes central because post-war Germany gradually faced increasing pressure to acknowledge publicly the crimes committed within concentration camps and the broader role of German institutions, industries, and bureaucracies in supporting the Nazi system, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen evolved into more than a former prison site. It became a location forcing societies to confront uncomfortable truths regarding obedience, complicity, dehumanization, and the fragility of democratic values, and as this develops further, the role of survivor testimony becomes increasingly significant because former prisoners returning to Sachsenhausen after the war provided essential first-hand accounts helping preserve the reality of camp life against denial, forgetting, or political distortion, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the post-war history of Sachsenhausen revealed how landscapes of terror can continue, shaping societies long after the collapse of the regimes that created them, and thus the transformation of the camp after liberation can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, exposing how memory, politics, and historical responsibility became intertwined within the ruins of one of the Nazi system's most important camps near Berlin. As decades passed after the liberation of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, it becomes evident that the camp gradually transformed into one of the most important memorial and educational sites connected to the history of the Holocaust and Nazi repression because preserving Sachsenhausen allowed later generations to confront directly the physical structures where forced labor, executions, medical experiments, punishment, and systematic dehumanization had once occurred beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, and as this develops, the concept of remembrance through place becomes increasingly significant because the camp's surviving architecture, including watchtowers, barracks foundations, roll call areas, and Station Z, continues communicating the realities of concentration camp life in ways that written records alone often cannot fully convey, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that physical environments possess extraordinary emotional power when connected to historical trauma, allowing visitors to imagine more directly the scale of suffering experienced by prisoners trapped inside Sachsenhausen during the war years, and as this develops further, the role of education becomes central because memorial institutions at Sachsenhausen gradually developed exhibitions, archives, guided tours, and research programs designed to teach future generations about the concentration camp system, the Holocaust, political repression, and the dangers of authoritarian ideology, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that historical education at sites like Sachsenhausen serves not only to preserve memory but also to strengthen awareness regarding human rights, democracy, and the warning signs of political extremism in modern society, and as this develops, the concept of visible warning becomes increasingly apparent because the camp demonstrates physically how ordinary bureaucratic systems, architecture, and industrial organization can be transformed into instruments of terror. Once human beings are stripped of dignity through propaganda, racism, and authoritarian power, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen forces visitors to confront uncomfortable realities regarding how modern civilization itself became capable of organizing mass imprisonment, forced labor, and systematic violence within highly structured institutional environments, and as this develops further, the role of survivor testimony becomes increasingly significant because former prisoners who returned to the camp after the war helped shape remembrance efforts by sharing personal experiences connected to roll call punishments, forced labor, Station Z, death marches, and everyday survival within the camp system. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that these testimonies transformed Sachsenhausen from an abstract historical site into a deeply human space carrying the voices and memories of individuals who endured unimaginable suffering there. And as this develops, the concept of intergenerational responsibility becomes central, because as survivors gradually aged and passed away, the responsibility for preserving the truth of Sachsenhausen shifted increasingly toward historians, educators, memorial institutions, and future generations committed to protecting historical memory from denial or indifference. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that remembrance itself requires active effort, especially as time creates emotional distance between modern societies and the lived reality of the Holocaust. And as this develops further, the role of complexity becomes increasingly apparent, because Sachsenhausen's history includes multiple layers involving Nazi terror, wartime forced labor, executions, Soviet occupation, Cold War politics, and post-war memorialization, requiring careful historical interpretation rather than simplistic narratives alone. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that preserving such complexity matters deeply, because it reflects the broader reality of 20th generations across the continent. And as this develops, the concept of moral reflection becomes increasingly significant, because visitors confronting Sachsenhausen today are challenged not only to learn historical facts but also to consider larger questions regarding obedience, prejudice, political extremism, and the vulnerability of democratic societies when fear and hatred become normalized. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp remains profoundly relevant, precisely because the mechanisms that created it, dehumanization, propaganda, authoritarianism, and institutional obedience, have never disappeared entirely from human society. And as this develops further, the role of the preserved camp becomes increasingly apparent, because every remaining structure at Sachsenhausen stands today as physical evidence against forgetting, exposing the reality of a system that attempted to reduce millions of people into anonymous prisoners stripped of rights, identity, and humanity. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen after the war transformed from a hidden instrument of Nazi repression into a permanent place of memory, education, and warning for the modern world. And thus, the post-war legacy of the camp can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, ensuring that the suffering endured near Berlin remains visible long after the collapse of the regime that created the concentration camp system. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Why Sachsenhausen Still Matters Today. As the history of Sachsenhausen concentration camp moves beyond the years of the World War II and into the modern world, it becomes evident that the camp remains profoundly important, not only because of the atrocities committed there, but because it reveals how modern societies themselves can descend into systems of organized cruelty once authoritarian ideology, propaganda, and dehumanization overpower democratic values and human empathy. And as this develops, the concept of historical warning becomes central, because Sachsenhausen demonstrates with terrifying clarity that concentration camps were not accidents created by chaos alone, but carefully organized institutions designed, administered, and maintained by a technologically advanced state operating near Berlin. And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the camp's existence challenges comforting assumptions that education, industrial progress, bureaucracy, or national development automatically protect societies from moral collapse. And as this develops further, the role of ordinary institutions becomes increasingly significant because Sachsenhausen functioned through cooperation among administrators, guards, engineers, industrial planners, transportation systems, police structures, medical personnel, and bureaucratic offices that together transformed ideology into daily systems of imprisonment, labor, punishment, and death beneath the authority of Nazi Germany. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that one of the camp's most disturbing lessons lies in how ordinary professional structures can become instruments of terror once ethical boundaries disappear beneath obedience and extremist political doctrine. And as this develops, the concept of gradual radicalization becomes central because Sachsenhausen did not emerge suddenly from complete lawlessness but developed step by step through political repression, propaganda campaigns, emergency powers, racial ideology, and the normalization of violence against targeted groups long before the full machinery of the Holocaust expanded across Europe. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp warns future generations about the dangers of ignoring early signs of authoritarianism and dehumanization while democratic protections still exist, and as this develops further, the role of propaganda becomes increasingly apparent because the Nazi regime relied heavily upon controlling information, shaping public perception, and spreading racial and political hatred in order to justify imprisonment, forced labor, executions, and exclusion of entire populations from moral concern. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that propaganda created emotional conditions where cruelty could appear acceptable, necessary, or even patriotic to portions of society conditioned gradually to fear and despise targeted groups. And as this develops, the concept of dehumanization becomes increasingly significant because the concentration camp system depended fundamentally upon redefining prisoners as enemies, outsiders, racial threats, or expendable bodies rather than recognizing them as fellow human beings possessing dignity and rights. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen reveals how quickly violence becomes possible once societies begin treating certain categories of people as less deserving of empathy, protection, or legal equality. And as this develops further, the role of fear becomes increasingly apparent because the camp system functioned partly through terror directed not only at prisoners, but also at the wider population, demonstrating the consequences of political opposition, dissent, resistance, or exclusion from the ideological vision of the Nazi state. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that fear and silence often allow authoritarian systems to expand gradually by discouraging resistance before violence becomes impossible to ignore. And as this develops, the concept of memory becomes central because preserving Sachsenhausen ensures that the suffering experienced there remains visible to future generations rather than disappearing beneath historical distance, denial, or indifference. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that memory itself functions as a form of resistance against the original Nazi attempt to erase victims through imprisonment, executions, forced labor, and bureaucratic dehumanization. And as this develops further, the role of survivor testimony becomes increasingly significant because the voices of former prisoners transformed Sachsenhausen from an abandoned camp into a historical witness exposing how ordinary human beings endured and resisted within systems designed to destroy dignity and hope. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that Sachsenhausen still matters today because it confronts humanity with enduring questions about morality, obedience, prejudice, political extremism, and the fragility of civilized society under authoritarian pressure. and thus the continuing relevance of the camp can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing why the lessons of Sachsenhausen remain essential for the modern world long after the collapse of the Nazi regime. As modern generations continue visiting Sachsenhausen concentration camp decades after liberation, it becomes evident that the camp remains one of the clearest physical reminders of how systems of repression can emerge within modern industrial societies when human beings are divided through ideology, fear, and state power because the preserved watchtowers, prison, barracks, roll call square, execution areas, and surviving camp structures continue exposing the reality that organized cruelty once operated openly near the political center of Berlin, and as this develops, the concept of visible history becomes increasingly significant because standing inside Sachsenhausen allows visitors to confront directly the physical environment where prisoners endured forced labor, starvation, punishment, executions, medical experiments, and death. Marches beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that physical places possess extraordinary power in preserving historical memory, precisely because they transform abstract historical facts into visible human reality. And as this develops further, the role of empathy becomes central, because memorial sites like Sachsenhausen encourage later generations to imagine the experiences of prisoners not merely as distant statistics, but as real individuals whose lives, families, identities, and futures were violently interrupted by the concentration camp system, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that restoring individuality to victims directly challenges the dehumanization that formed the foundation of Nazi ideology, ensuring that prisoners are remembered as human beings rather than anonymous numbers within historical records, and as this develops, the concept of intergenerational responsibility becomes increasingly apparent, because as survivors gradually pass away, the responsibility for preserving the truth of Sachsenhausen falls increasingly upon educators, historians, memorial institutions, and future generations determined to protect historical memory against denial, distortion, or indifference. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that remembrance requires constant effort precisely because time naturally creates emotional distance from past atrocities, making historical education essential for sustaining awareness of how such systems emerged and operated. And as this develops further, the role of democratic values becomes increasingly significant because Sachsenhausen demonstrates the catastrophic consequences that can follow when legal protections, political pluralism, freedom of expression, and human rights collapse beneath authoritarian rule and ideological extremism. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the camp serves not only as a memorial to past victims but also as a warning regarding the dangers facing any society where propaganda, racism, nationalism, or political hatred begin redefining certain groups as threats undeserving of equal dignity or protection. And as this develops, the concept of moral vigilance becomes central because the history of Sachsenhausen reveals that systems of persecution often develop gradually through normalization of prejudice, expansion of state power, erosion of rights, and public silence rather than appearing instantly in their most extreme forms. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that understanding the camp requires examining not only the violence itself but also the political and social conditions that allowed such violence to become institutionalized within modern society. And as this develops further, the role of human resilience becomes increasingly apparent because despite the brutality surrounding them, prisoners inside Sachsenhausen preserved acts of solidarity, resistance, memory, and emotional survival that challenged the camp's attempt to erase humanity completely, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that remembering Sachsenhausen also means remembering the courage and endurance of individuals who maintained fragments of dignity and compassion even within one of the darkest systems of repression in modern history. And as this develops, the concept of permanent warning becomes increasingly significant, because the camp stands today as evidence that civilized societies are never permanently immune from hatred, authoritarianism, or organized violence once fear and dehumanization begin shaping public life and political power. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen still matters because it forces humanity to confront both the depths of cruelty possible within modern systems and the continuing responsibility to defend human dignity, historical truth, and democratic values against those same dangers in the present and future. And thus, the enduring legacy of Sachsenhausen can be understood as the defining conclusion of the narrative, preserving forever the warning carried by the camp near Berlin and the voices of those who suffered within its walls. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The Men Behind the Barbed Wire. As the history of Sachsenhausen concentration camp reaches its final chapter of reflection, it becomes evident that one of the most important truths about the camp lies in remembering the prisoners not simply as victims within a historical system but as individual human beings whose lives were violently interrupted by the machinery of Nazi Germany, because behind every prisoner number, uniform triangle, and camp record existed a person with memories, relationships, ambitions, fears, and a life that once extended far beyond the fences surrounding Sachsenhausen. And as this develops, the concept of stolen humanity becomes central, because the concentration camp system depended fundamentally upon reducing people into categories while stripping away individuality through uniforms, shaved heads, forced labor, surveillance, punishment, and bureaucratic classification. And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the Nazi regime sought not only to imprison bodies but also to erase identity itself by transforming prisoners into anonymous units easier to control, exploit, and eventually destroy. And as this develops further, the role of diversity among prisoners becomes increasingly significant, because Sachsenhausen held people from many different nations, professions, religions, and political backgrounds, including resistance fighters, journalists, teachers, clergy, workers, students, intellectuals, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, political dissidents, and countless civilians, swept into the expanding machinery of Nazi repression during the World War II. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the camp represented a cross-section of the groups targeted by authoritarian ideology and state violence across Europe, revealing how broad the reach of persecution became beneath the Nazi system. And as this develops, the concept of interrupted ordinary life becomes central, because many prisoners at Sachsenhausen had once lived entirely ordinary civilian lives before arrest, deportation, and imprisonment suddenly shattered their futures, separating families and pulling individuals into a world governed entirely by fear, forced labor, and survival. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the horror of the camp lay partly in how abruptly normal existence could disappear once political repression and racial ideology expanded into systems of organized imprisonment. And as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly apparent, because restoring individuality to the prisoners challenges the dehumanization at the core of the concentration camp system by refusing to allow victims to remain anonymous within historical narratives. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that remembrance carries moral importance precisely because the SS attempted systematically to erase individuality through numbering systems, administrative classifications, and routines designed to reduce prisoners into expendable labor. Bodies beneath total institutional control, and as this develops, the concept of emotional endurance becomes increasingly significant because surviving Sachsenhausen required more than physical endurance alone. Prisoners also struggled constantly to preserve fragments of personal identity, hope, dignity, and emotional connection within an environment specifically designed to destroy all four, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that even small acts, sharing food, remembering a family member, helping another prisoner stand during roll call, whispering, forbidden conversations, or preserving cultural memory, became forms of resistance against the camp's attempt to erase humanity completely, and as this develops further, the role of solidarity becomes increasingly apparent because prisoners often depended upon one another emotionally and physically in order to survive forced labor, starvation, punishment, and the endless uncertainty shaping daily life inside the camp. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that solidarity represented one of the few remaining forms of human agency available within a system built entirely around domination and fear, and as this develops, they carried emotional burdens connected to lost families, destroyed communities, uncertainty regarding loved ones, and the overwhelming trauma of watching friends disappear through executions, disease, labor exhaustion, or death marches, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that suffering inside the camp extended far beyond physical violence alone into profound psychological and emotional devastation lasting long after liberation itself. And as this develops further, the role of testimony becomes increasingly significant because survivors who later described life inside Sachsenhausen restored human voices to a history the Nazi system attempted to reduce into bureaucratic silence, preserving personal experiences that exposed the emotional reality hidden behind camp statistics and administrative records, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that remembering the men behind the barbed wire means recognizing that the prisoners of Sachsenhausen were not abstract victims of history but individuals whose humanity survived despite every effort to erase it, and thus the personal stories carried within the camp can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing the human lives trapped inside one of the Nazi regime's most important concentration camps near Berlin. As the memory of Sachsenhausen concentration camp continues into the modern world, it becomes evident that understanding the prisoners as individuals rather than anonymous victims fundamentally changes how the camp itself is remembered, because every surviving testimony, photograph, letter, and personal account restores fragments of humanity to people whom the Nazi concentration camp system attempted deliberately to reduce into silence, numbers, and disposable labor beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, and as this develops, the concept of identity restored becomes increasingly significant because remembering names, professions, relationships, and personal histories directly challenges the ideological dehumanization that made concentration camps possible in the first place, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the prisoners of Sachsenhausen represented countless individual worlds destroyed or permanently altered by imprisonment, forced labor, executions, disease, starvation, and the endless fear shaping camp existence during the war years, and as this develops further, the role of testimony becomes central because survivors carried memories of the camp long after liberation, describing Not only violence and suffering, but also moments of friendship, solidarity, resistance, and emotional endurance that revealed how humanity persisted even inside environments designed specifically to erase dignity and hope. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that survivor accounts transformed Sachsenhausen from an abandoned historical site into a deeply human narrative filled with voices refusing to disappear despite the regime's attempt to erase them. And as this develops, the concept of emotional survival becomes increasingly apparent because many prisoners survived physically while carrying lifelong psychological wounds connected to hunger, forced labor, public punishment, executions, death marches, and the constant uncertainty surrounding survival inside the camp system. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that liberation did not erase trauma instantly but instead marked the beginning of another struggle involving memory, grief, recovery, and the challenge of rebuilding identity after years of dehumanization and terror. And as this develops further, the role of absence becomes increasingly significant because countless prisoners never survived Sachsenhausen at all, leaving behind families who often never learned exactly how or where loved ones died within the concentration camp system. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the camp created enormous landscapes of grief extending far beyond the prison fences themselves into communities across Europe shattered by deportation, persecution, and wartime destruction. And as this develops, the concept of remembrance as justice becomes central because preserving the identities and stories of prisoners ensures that those consumed by the camp system are not erased completely beneath bureaucratic records or historical abstraction. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that memory itself becomes a form of resistance against the original Nazi objective of reducing human beings into anonymous labor units stripped of individuality and moral value. And as this develops further, the role of future generations becomes increasingly apparent because as survivors disappear, the responsibility for remembering the prisoners of Sachsenhausen shifts toward historians, educators, memorial institutions, and ordinary people willing to preserve historical truth against denial, indifference, or distortion. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that remembering the camp requires more than studying structures or political systems alone. It also demands emotional recognition of the human suffering experienced by individuals trapped within those systems. And as this develops, the concept of universal humanity becomes increasingly significant because the prisoners of Sachsenhausen came from different countries, religions, professions, and political beliefs, yet shared the same vulnerability. Once authoritarian ideology categorized them as enemies, outsiders, or expendable populations beneath state power. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp's history warns humanity about the danger of allowing prejudice, propaganda, and political extremism to redefine who deserves dignity, empathy, and legal protection within society. And as this develops further, the role of the preserved memorial becomes increasingly apparent because every remaining structure at Sachsenhausen now exists partly to ensure that the men behind the barbed wire are remembered not simply as victims of history but as real human beings whose lives mattered before, during, and after the horrors of the concentration camp system. And as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the final legacy of Sachsenhausen lies not only in exposing the brutality of the Nazi regime but also in preserving the humanity of those who endured it, and thus the memory of the prisoners can be understood as the defining emotional conclusion of the narrative, ensuring that the voices of those trapped behind The barbed wire near Berlin continues speaking to future generations long after the collapse of the regime that imprisoned them. Chapter 5, Segment 2. The Camp Beside the Capital. As the history of Sachsenhausen concentration camp reaches its final reflections, it becomes evident that one of the most disturbing aspects of the camp was its location itself, because Sachsenhausen stood only a short distance from Berlin, the political heart of Nazi Germany, meaning that one of the regime's most important concentration camps operated not in some distant hidden wilderness but near the center of governmental authority, bureaucracy, propaganda, and modern urban life. And as this develops, the concept of terror beside civilization becomes central, because Sachsenhausen exposed how organized brutality could exist alongside ordinary daily existence within a highly developed society where trains ran, offices functioned, families lived normal lives, and state institutions carried out routine administration even while prisoners suffered behind barbed wire nearby. And as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the camp's location challenges the comforting belief that atrocities emerge only in isolated or lawless environments far removed from modern civilization. And as this develops further, the role of proximity becomes increasingly significant, because Sachsenhausen was intentionally positioned near Berlin partly due to its administrative importance within the concentration camp system, allowing SS officials to supervise operations, train personnel, and coordinate policies close to the Nazi capital itself. And as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the camp functioned not as a hidden deviation from the regime but as an integrated part of the state apparatus operating near the very center of political power. And as this develops, the concept of normalized repression becomes central, because the existence of Sachsenhausen near Berlin reflected how thoroughly authoritarianism had become embedded within German political and institutional life during the 1930s and 1940s, transforming imprisonment, forced labor, and terror into accepted instruments of governance beneath Nazi ideology. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that concentration camps depended not only upon isolated perpetrators but upon broader systems involving transportation networks, administrative offices, police structures, industrial cooperation, and bureaucratic organization functioning across society itself. And as this develops further, the role of visibility becomes increasingly apparent, because although the full scale of atrocities remained concealed through censorship, propaganda, and secrecy, the existence of concentration camps and political repression was not entirely invisible within Germany. Particularly as prisoners disappeared, rumors circulated, and fear spread throughout society regarding the consequences of opposing the regime. And as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that authoritarian systems often rely upon combinations of public intimidation and selective concealment, allowing violence to remain partly visible as a warning while obscuring its full brutality from ordinary public life. And as this develops, the concept of bureaucratic evil becomes increasingly significant, because Sachsenhausen demonstrated how ordinary administrative systems can support extraordinary violence once moral limits collapse beneath ideology and obedience to state authority. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that guards, clerks, engineers, doctors, railway officials, industrial planners, and countless others participated within structures that sustained the camp system while often perceiving themselves simply as fulfilling professional duties. And as this develops further, the role of routine becomes increasingly apparent, because much of the machinery sustaining Sachsenhausen operated through everyday institutional processes, records, schedules, transport, orders, construction plans, labor assignments, and administrative regulations transforming organized cruelty into something frighteningly systematic and normalized, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that one of the camp's deepest warnings lies in how ordinary modern structures can become instruments of repression once societies begin treating targeted populations as less deserving of rights, empathy, or humanity, and as this develops, the concept of silence becomes central because fear, propaganda, conformity, and political repression discouraged resistance within German society while allowing concentration camps to continue operating beside urban centers and government institutions, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that authoritarian systems often expand gradually through silence and adaptation long before their most extreme violence becomes impossible to deny, and as this develops further, the role of moral responsibility becomes increasingly significant because Sachsenhausen forces later generations to confront difficult questions regarding complicity, obedience, indifference, and the social conditions that allow systems of persecution to become integrated into ordinary political life, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the camp beside Berlin stands today as a warning that modern civilization itself is not immune to organized brutality. When democratic protections collapse beneath authoritarian ideology and dehumanization, and thus, the location of Sachsenhausen can be understood as a defining stage in the narrative, revealing how terror and bureaucracy operated side by side near the center of Nazi power itself. As modern visitors walk through the preserved grounds of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, today, it becomes evident that the camp's closeness to Berlin continues carrying enormous symbolic meaning because the site forces people to confront the reality that one of the Nazi regime's most important systems of repression operated beside one of Europe's major political and cultural capitals, and as this develops, the concept of ordinary society beside terror becomes increasingly significant because Sachsenhausen demonstrates that concentration camps did not emerge outside civilization but within it, supported by modern infrastructure, state institutions, industrial systems, and political structures functioning daily around them, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the camp reveals how authoritarianism can reshape ordinary society gradually until repression becomes woven into the fabric of public life itself. Beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, and as this develops further, the role of propaganda becomes central because the Nazi regime relied heavily upon controlling information, glorifying obedience, spreading racial ideology, and presenting political enemies as threats in order to normalize repression while discouraging public resistance against expanding systems of imprisonment and violence, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that propaganda did not simply hide the concentration camps. It helped create emotional and political conditions where large portions of society accepted or ignored persecution directed at targeted groups, and as this develops, the concept of gradual moral erosion becomes increasingly apparent, because Sachsenhausen illustrates how societies rarely collapse into organized brutality instantly, but instead move through stages where prejudice, fear, conformity, and state power slowly weaken democratic values and empathy over time, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp's existence near Berlin warns future generations about the dangers of ignoring early signs of authoritarianism, especially when governments begin attacking political opponents, restricting freedoms, or portraying certain populations as less deserving of rights and protection. And as this develops further, the role of education becomes increasingly significant, because Preserving Sachsenhausen allows modern societies to study not only the Holocaust itself but also the political, social, and institutional processes that enabled concentration camps to become normalized within a technologically advanced modern state, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that understanding these processes remains essential precisely because many of the forces that created Sachsenhausen, fear, propaganda, racism, political extremism, and obedience, continue appearing in different forms throughout human history, and as this develops, the concept of democratic vigilance becomes central because the camp stands today as evidence that democratic institutions and human rights require constant protection against movements seeking to weaken legal equality, independent thought, or moral responsibility in the name of ideology, nationalism, or security. And as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen matters not only as a historical memorial but also as a living warning regarding the fragility of civilized society under political pressure, and as this develops further, the role of memory becomes increasingly apparent, because remembering that such a camp operated near Berlin prevents later generations from distancing themselves emotionally from the crimes of the Nazi era by imagining them as events occurring only in distant or abnormal places, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the camp's proximity to the capital forces confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that organized cruelty can emerge from highly organized, educated, and industrialized societies once dehumanization becomes institutionalized beneath state authority, and as this develops, the concept of human responsibility becomes increasingly significant because Sachsenhausen challenges individuals and societies alike to consider how ordinary people respond when political systems begin targeting minorities, destroying freedoms, and normalizing hatred within public life, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp beside Berlin remains relevant precisely because it demonstrates how silence, fear, obedience, and indifference can allow authoritarian systems to expand step by step, until repression becomes embedded deeply within institutions and daily reality. And as this develops further, the role of the memorial site becomes increasingly apparent, because every preserved fence, watchtower, and Baroque foundation at Sachsenhausen now serves as physical testimony that one of history's most brutal systems once operated beside the capital of a modern European nation, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the final warning of Sachsenhausen lies in its location itself. Terror does not always emerge far away from civilization but can grow directly beside it when societies fail to defend humanity, truth, and democratic values against extremism and dehumanization, and thus the camp near Berlin can be understood as the defining warning of the entire narrative, exposing how ordinary society and organized terror became intertwined beneath the Nazi regime. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Final Reflection. Inside Sachsenhausen. As the story of Sachsenhausen concentration camp reaches its final reflection, it becomes evident that the camp stands today as far more than a historical location connected to the World War II, because Sachsenhausen exposed one of the darkest possibilities within modern civilization itself: the ability of a technologically advanced and bureaucratically organized society to transform ordinary institutions into machinery of repression, forced labor, fear, and death beneath the authority of Nazi Germany, and as this develops, the concept of organized cruelty becomes central because the camp was not created through chaos or isolated violence alone but through deliberate planning involving architecture, transportation systems, administrative structures, propaganda, industrial labor, political ideology, and institutional obedience working together toward systems of domination and dehumanization, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen represented the convergence of many different elements of authoritarian power, surveillance, punishment, forced labor, imprisonment, execution, psychological terror, and ideological indoctrination, all operating within one carefully structured environment near Berlin, and as this develops further, the role of dehumanization becomes increasingly significant because none of the brutality inside Sachsenhausen would have been possible without first convincing guards, administrators, and wider society that certain categories of people no longer deserved equal dignity, rights, or empathy, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that the concentration camp system depended fundamentally upon redefining human beings as enemies, outsiders, racial threats, or expendable labor units rather than individuals possessing humanity and moral worth. And as this develops, the concept of gradual collapse becomes central because the Nazi system did not transform Germany overnight into a state capable of building concentration camps. Instead, authoritarianism expanded step by step through propaganda, political intimidation, racial ideology, censorship, fear, and the erosion of democratic protections long before the camp system reached its most extreme forms, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen warns later generations about the danger of ignoring early signs of political extremism and dehumanization, while societies still possess the ability to resist them, and as this develops further, the role of ordinary institutions becomes increasingly apparent, because the camp operated through railway systems transporting prisoners, industries exploiting forced labor, bureaucracies managing records, doctors conducting experiments, guards enforcing discipline, and administrators organizing executions, revealing how modern professional structures themselves can become instruments of violence once moral responsibility disappears beneath obedience and ideology. And, as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that one of the most disturbing truths about Sachsenhausen lies in how ordinary routines and institutions became normalized, components of extraordinary cruelty within the Nazi state, and as this develops, the concept of human endurance becomes increasingly significant because despite starvation, forced labor, punishment, executions, and death marches, prisoners inside Sachsenhausen continued preserving fragments of solidarity, memory, resistance, and emotional survival within an environment designed specifically to destroy hope and individuality, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the survival of human dignity under such conditions remains one of the most powerful aspects of the camp's history, revealing that even within systems built around terror, people continued helping one another, preserving identity, and resisting complete moral destruction. And, as this develops further, the role of testimony becomes increasingly apparent, because survivors, who later spoke about Sachsenhausen, transformed the camp from a hidden instrument of Nazi repression into a visible historical warning preserved through personal memory and witness accounts, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that testimony itself became an act of resistance against the Nazi attempt to erase victims through imprisonment, executions, cremation, and bureaucratic anonymity, and as this develops, the concept of remembrance becomes central because preserving Sachsenhausen today ensures that future generations confront directly the realities of authoritarian violence rather than allowing such history to fade into abstraction or denial, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp remains relevant precisely because the forces that created it, hatred, propaganda, obedience, political extremism, and dehumanization, continue existing in different forms throughout the modern world, and as this develops further, the role of moral warning becomes increasingly significant because Sachsenhausen demonstrates how quickly societies can normalize cruelty once fear and ideology begin overpowering empathy, democratic values, and legal protections, and as one considers the broader implications, it becomes evident that the final lesson of Sachsenhausen lies not only in remembering the suffering that occurred there but also in recognizing the continuing responsibility to defend humanity and truth against systems seeking to divide, dehumanize, and dominate others through power and fear, and thus the camp near Berlin can be understood as the defining warning of the entire narrative, exposing both the depths of human cruelty and the enduring necessity of historical memory. As the final reflection upon Sachsenhausen concentration camp comes to a close, it becomes evident that the camp's enduring significance lies not only in the scale of suffering experienced there but in the questions it forces humanity to confront about civilization, morality, obedience, and the fragility of democratic society itself, because Sachsenhausen revealed that modern states possess the ability to organize systems of terror with extraordinary efficiency once political ideology removes moral limits and reduces human beings into categories considered expendable beneath state authority, and as this develops, the concept of civilization under pressure becomes increasingly significant because the camp demonstrated that education, technological advancement, industrial progress, and bureaucratic organization alone do not prevent societies from descending into brutality when empathy and human rights are sacrificed to authoritarianism and fear, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that Sachsenhausen functioned not outside modern civilization but within it, supported by railways, administrative offices, industries, propaganda systems, police structures, and political institutions operating near the center of Berlin itself, and as this develops further, the role of memory becomes central, because preserving the camp ensures that the prisoners who suffered behind its fences are not reduced into anonymous historical statistics but remembered as individuals whose lives carried meaning before the concentration camp system attempted to erase them, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that remembrance represents a form of moral resistance against the dehumanization at the core of Nazi ideology, restoring identity and dignity to those whom the regime sought to reduce into numbered labor bodies beneath the machinery of repression, and as survivors disappear, the obligation to preserve the truth of Sachsenhausen falls increasingly upon later generations who never witnessed the camp directly yet must continue defending historical memory against denial, indifference, or distortion, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that historical memory cannot survive automatically but requires active education, research, memorialization, and public willingness to confront painful truths about the past. And as this develops further, the role of warning becomes increasingly significant because Sachsenhausen exposes how authoritarian systems often grow gradually through propaganda, fear, prejudice, and political polarization long before they reach the stage of open mass violence and concentration camps, and as one considers the broader environment, it becomes evident that the camp remains relevant precisely because the mechanisms that created it, dehumanization, obedience, nationalism, hatred, and the erosion of democratic protections, continue threatening societies in different forms across the modern world, and as this develops, the concept of moral choice becomes central because the history of Sachsenhausen repeatedly demonstrates that individuals and institutions faced decisions regarding conformity, silence, resistance, cooperation, or compassion within systems of repression, revealing how ordinary human choices collectively shape the direction of societies under political pressure, and as one reflects on this, it becomes clear that the camp warns future generations not only about dictators and ideologies but also about the dangers of indifference when rights are attacked and targeted groups are excluded from public empathy and legal protection, and as this develops further, the role of human resilience becomes increasingly apparent, because even inside Sachsenhausen prisoners preserved acts of solidarity, memory, and resistance that prevented the concentration camp system from destroying humanity completely, and as one considers the implications of this, it becomes evident that these acts of survival and compassion remain essential parts of the camp's legacy, reminding later generations that dignity can persist even under conditions designed to erase it, and as this develops, the concept of permanent testimony becomes increasingly significant because the preserved fences, watchtowers, barracks foundations, execution areas, and memorials at Sachsenhausen continue, speaking silently across generations about the consequences of hatred and authoritarian power. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes clear that the final lesson of Sachsenhausen is not only about the past but about the present and future responsibility of humanity to defend truth, democracy, empathy, and human dignity against systems seeking once again to divide people into categories of worth and unworthiness, and thus the final reflection upon Sachsenhausen can be understood as the concluding stage in the narrative, preserving forever the warning carried by the camp near Berlin and the voices of those who endured its machinery of terror. The fences of Sachsenhausen concentration camp still stand today just outside Berlin. The watchtowers remain. The roll call square is still there. And within those grounds lives the memory of thousands of prisoners who were forced into a system built on fear, labor, punishment, and death. Sachsenhausen was more than a prison camp. It became one of the central engines of the Nazi concentration camp system, a place where terror was organized, perfected, and expanded across Europe. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and countless others disappeared behind its barbed wire, and many never came back out. But despite everything the regime tried to destroy, the truth survived. In survivor testimonies, in the documents left behind, and in the memories of those who refused to let the victims vanish into silence. If you found this documentary powerful and want more deep cinematic history documentaries like this, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next documentary.